Welcome to the Likeville podcast. My name is John Faithful Hamer, and today I'll be talking to Aaron Haspel. Aaron Haspel has written a book of aphorisms called Everything, which is my favorite book of aphorisms in the English language. It's fantastic. So we're going to be talking about all sorts of things, but I thought, first of all, just if you could say a little bit about why you write aphorisms as opposed to something else.
Oh, yeah, I used to write in longer forms, essays and so forth. And in fact, I used to be very keen on arguing and debating and all the things that people tend to do in essays. But after a while, you get old, you get tired, and you really don't feel like explaining yourself anymore. And the thing about aphorisms is you don't have to show your work. Remember when you were in school, you were in
Yeah,
math class,
yeah,
and in math class, in algebra or something, okay, they'd always say, show your work, show your work.
yeah. You wouldn't get full marks if you didn't show your work.
Exactly. And you knew what the answer was, and you knew how to get to the answer, but you didn't really want to retrace the steps in your mind because it was kind of tiresome. So basically, you didn't
Mm-hmm.
want to show your work, you just wrote down the answer. Well, the thing
Mm-hmm.
about essays and especially books is that they're like school. They more or less require you to show your work. Great thing about aphorisms is that you don't have to show your work.
Well,
And at
the
this
yeah,
at this point, I'm too old. I'm too old for school. I don't want to show my work anymore.
yeah. Well, I think the logic behind it, maybe people are not always totally clear about it, but if you look in Plato's Republic, where it talks about, how if you ask somebody what's two plus two, right? Some people will just say, five or seven, some wrong answer, but there can be the case where two people have the right answer. One, they both say that it's four, but one of them has a completely insane methodology for getting to four, which will not apply to any other thing. So you need to know not only that the person has the right answer, but that they arrived at it in a sort of in the right way. So that's the logic behind it. But
Well, I can understand the logic behind it if you're teaching algebra to ninth graders. All right. But I'm no longer a ninth grader and I'm no longer learning algebra. And most of the aphorisms that I write, the thought process that's behind them is not going to be generally applicable to some other, exercise in the back of the book. So the objections that Plato makes, okay, or the reasons that Plato gives for showing your work, I don't think really apply very well in my case.
okay, the aphoristic genre in the ancient world was very popular for practical reasons because books were extremely expensive and rare, and most people were illiterate. So if you were, let's say, like an Epicurean or a Stoic or whatever, you would have a number of aphorisms that you would memorize, and then you would
Oh, well,
live by them,
well, sure.
right?
I mean, the,
But
the Greek
since the
the Greek
printing press,
anthology is
right?
basically an entire book of aphorisms, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so I'm wondering, do you think there's a chance in the 21st century with Twitter and with social media to sort of go back to the aphorism?
Go back to it? I don't know about going back to it. I'm not sure it's ever really left us. Okay.
Really?
Yeah, really.
It seems to me like if you go back a couple hundred years, that it was completely normal for writers to experiment with that genre, and it's kind of atypical in this day and age.
maybe. There are two ways of looking at this, I guess. One way is to look at it from the point of view of the author. Are people explicitly publishing books of aphorisms? But the other, more important way is to look at it from the point of view of the reader. Do readers still read things as aphorisms? Are they still influenced by aphorisms? Do aphorisms still exercise, some sort of control over their daily lives? And I think the answer is very much yes. Now, of course, they go under a variety of names, maxims or
Hmm.
proverbs or sayings or what have you, but it's very definitely aphorisms that we're talking about here.
Hmm.
And children are also taught variations of these things, like Mother Goose in nursery rhymes and so forth. You can abstract a lot of things from that. So I don't think the form has ever really disappeared. And I think whether authors decide I'm going to make an explicit book of aphorisms and publish it as a book of aphorisms is really a secondary point. I think the genre will always be with us, which is to say, the short sentence with a twist at the end that's, witty and says something unexpected. And, I think, as I wrote in the introduction to my book, most people rule their lives with maybe, half a dozen or a dozen of these things. I think that's always been the case. And I think that's going to continue to be the case in the foreseeable future.
Okay, well, I'll get into the content a little bit. As you know, I've assigned your book to a number of classes, and the students usually are hooked after the first chapter because,
poor kids.
Because it's on schooling, and you, of course, have a lot of, you're highly critical of the education system. So what is your problem with school? You seem to have you have a lot of negative things to say about the education system.
Oh, sure, I do. Well, I suppose
why?
I suppose we could best summarize it in one of my aphorisms, which is to say, school spoils you for learning and jobs spoil you for work. Now, the problem with school is that it's designed as a sort of series of exercises. The teacher tells you you have to do something, you have to practice this thing, you have to hand in your homework, you have to get your homework back. And the whole process tends to have more to do with the teacher's expectation than it does with, actually learning any particular topic. There's another problem with school also, which is that you tend to split your time among various subjects, some of which may deeply interest you and others of which may interest you at all. If you have a deep interest in, say, art, and you want to spend all day in art class, and you have no interest in math, and you don't want to spend any time in math class, well, too bad for you, son. You've still got to spend an hour in art class, and you've got to spend an hour in math class, and there are no two ways about it. Whereas when we actually undertake to learn something on our own, to really learn a topic, whatever that may be, we tend to spend all of our time on that topic to the exclusion of really all else. And of course, that's exactly what school discourages.
Okay, I mean, I guess the counter argument would be that you want people to be more well-rounded. You don't want somebody who's sort of illiterate but is really, really good with numbers, or somebody who's highly literate and is completely numerically sort of idiotic.
Why is this a desideratum? Why do I care how well my car repairman can, I don't know, calculate the trajectory of a cannonball, for instance, some elementary physics problem. Why do I care?
Because he has the vote, and I have to deal with the consequences of decisions that he makes. So if he's a complete idiot, he doesn't understand statistics at all, and can be snowed by demagogues that are sort of telling him what's going on, and he has no way of figuring it out.
Oh, I see. But if he didn't have the vote, then it would be okay.
I would say it still would be a problem because, you think about it, mass education and at first was a lot of the logic for it was that it was a kind of inoculation against extremism, right? That there were these religious tent revival preachers and these who would go into areas, whip people into a frenzy, and sometimes this could be very bloody, very disordering. And so the idea was we will give people a basic education, and this will make them less susceptible to religious and political demagogue. So I would say
In,
even if he
in
didn't have
fact,
the vote,
in fact, that potted history is pretty much false from beginning to end. We took over public education more or less wholesale from the German system, and the Germans didn't have any of these problems. It's more or less a complete product of the progressive ideas to which the reformers and influential people of that period, the late 19th century, were in thrall at the time. So this is
okay.
just something you're making up after the fact. But even if it were true, so what?
So would you say that people who are highly educated are more likely to fall for sort of crazy ideas, or less likely, or no difference whatsoever?
Before I answer that question, I would like to make a distinction, which I do in the book, between education and schooling.
Okay.
All right. When you refer to someone as highly educated, you usually refer to someone who's been to school for a long, long time.
That would be that's not mine, but that's definitely the customary definition.
That's the customary definition, and I don't really think that's the case at all. Okay, if you've been to school for a long, long time, you can really make yourself into an idiot. Uh, it's no accident that Orwell once referred to ideas so stupid that only intellectuals can believe them. Okay, essentially, school is just another echo chamber, and what you learn in school is how to please your teachers and how to do well in school, and that does not transfer very well.
Well, you learn something else, which I think is actually quite potentially problematic. I know how much you love that word. You learn how to construct an argument, and you learn how to marshal evidence in support of an argument, which sounds like a really good thing, but actually very often is not, because it just makes you a very good sort of defense lawyer or a very good marketer of ideas that you've come to for other reasons, right? For sort of self-interested reasons or emotional reasons. And so it makes you very good at defending bad positions.
Well, that's what arguments are, essentially. J.P. Morgan once said that everyone does something for two reasons: a good reason and the real reason.
Well, I can see what you're talking about, right? Oh, go on.
And what is generally called intelligence or success in argument is simply the ability to make the good reason as plausible as possible. But no matter how plausible you make the good reason, it doesn't really matter, because the good reason is not the real reason.
Well, I could see that right now. I'm writing a review for Quillette about three new books: Yuval Harari's Homo Deus, and then Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now that just came out, and then Charles Mann's new book, The Wizard and the Prophet. And it's so evident to me what is wrong with Steven Pinker's book when you read it in conjunction with those two, because Harari and Mann are both very, very, I mean, they're intellectuals. They're very curious, and they're very uncertain, and they'll present a number of different possibilities, and they'll make predictions. And then when you read Steven Pinker, he's got a thesis, and it's very, very, he repeats it again and again, and he marshals a great deal of evidence, but there's no indication that it could be another way, like, at all, right? So you're hearing one side of a conversation, right? And you get by comparison, he seems like more of an ideologue, right? And I think, perversely, schooling makes you very good at that, right? Especially good at that, right?
Well, it makes you, as to extend your analogy, it makes you a better defense lawyer. Unfortunately, what you're a defense lawyer for is your own prejudices.
Yeah.
It
No,
does not
absolutely.
make you. It does not make you examine those prejudices. On the contrary, one can argue it makes you less likely to examine those prejudices because the better you become at constructing arguments in support of those prejudices, the less likely you are to question those premises in the first place. Whereas if you're not really all that good at constructing these elaborate arguments, it might occur to you that, maybe what I think about the subject is not right at all.
Yeah, I I wonder what you think about, because it totally fits into this, the whole idea of RQ, right? So it's this new idea, and they say that, well, first of all, you have IQ, right, which is, you can define it different ways. Perhaps as just your raw processing power of your brain, right? And then they came up with EQ, and they
Well,
said, well, that's like,
that's not really
yeah,
IQ. That's G, which is correlated heavily with IQ, and IQ tests are valuable insofar as they do measure G. G stands for general intelligence. But yeah, it's kind of like the CPU of your brain.
well, the problem with it, as Jonathan Haidt has uh, shown in a number of his studies, is that people who have a very high IQ, they tend to, if they're in a debate with somebody else, and if you ask them to, can you think of good arguments in favor of the opposite position? Right? They will give you a certain number of arguments in favor of the opposite position, but then when you ask them to defend the position they believe in, they'll give you a huge long list of very, you know, of arguments in defense of their position. And but the strange thing is as you said before, if you're not very good at making arguments, people who have um, sort of lower IQ and less education, they can't come up with as many arguments in favor of their side, but they generally speaking can come up with exactly the same number of arguments for the other side as the people who are really well educated and have high IQs. And so, what Jonathan Haidt takes away from this is that being really intelligent, being really well educated, very often makes you more bigoted and prejudiced, which just blows my mind. It's completely, against what it's supposed to do. What do you think about that?
Well, this reminds me of a excuse me. This reminds me of a game I still do sometimes play to torture petitioners on the street. People are out there with clipboards who want me to sign certain things in support of some cause or other, gay rights or environmental this or save the whales that or what have you. And it doesn't matter what the cause is. If I see one of these people, I will go up to them and I'll say, oh, I see you're soliciting for a controversial political cause. And they'll say, oh, that's right, it's blah, blah, blah. And then I cut them off right there. I say, well, the cause is controversial, which means that there are people who oppose this cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, yes. And then I say, well, in that case, they must have some reasons. What would you consider the strongest reason in opposition to your position?
Yeah, I'm sure that goes over really well.
Well, at this
It's
point, if they don't go on to the next somewhat likelier candidate, okay, they'll thump around, and sometimes they'll say that there aren't any arguments.
mm-hmm.
There are
Well, no,
literally
it's
no arguments, okay, in support of the opposite position, whatever the opposite position may be. And I have heard these people who, are not unintelligent people. They look like they're perfectly capable. They're out there breathing, and they certainly look like they're capable of feeding themselves. And yet they will maintain that, on a controversial political issue, there are literally no arguments in favor of the
mm-hmm.
position that they oppose. It's
Yeah,
really,
no,
it's really, it's quite an astonishing thing to behold.
yeah, the opposite. Once again, I Yuval Harari. He has a talk that I watched on YouTube. It's like a sort of an hour-long talk where he's introducing the main themes of his book Homo Deus, and he has this part at the end. He sort of lays out all these things that he thinks are happening and these developments, and then he has about 5-10 minutes at the end of the talk where he says, but I could be completely wrong about all this, and here's the ways in which I could be wrong. And if this happens in the future, that will demonstrate that I'm wrong and that it was something completely different. He sort of gives you the Coles notes on how to refute him. And I'm sort of used to this. I've seen these things happen before. So I thought that it was interesting, but it didn't sort of astound me. But my students who watched it, they all brought it up. Like in class, they were just like, that was amazing. I've never seen somebody make a detailed argument in favor of something and then say, oh, but I could be completely wrong, and here's how I could be completely wrong, right? Steven Pinker never does that, or at least I've never seen him do that. He makes the argument for a really long time in a very long book, and in all of that long book, you don't see any doubt. You don't see any indication that, maybe I'm wrong about this.
Well, there's a related phenomenon in the rationalist community, which is known as steel manning. Steel manning being the opposite of straw manning. Straw manning, of course, is when you take an opponent's argument and misrepresent it or summarize it in its weakest form in order to knock it down, because the weaker the form, the easier it is to knock down. And this is the sort of thing that you see in argument all the time. If, however, you are interested less in winning the argument than in finding out what's true, then the proper procedure is the opposite of that, which is known as steel manning, which is to say you take the opponent's argument, no matter how he himself made it, and you steel man it, you reinforce it, you restate it in its strongest possible form, because that's the form you should be dealing with.
Yeah, well, that goes back to this idea of RQ, right? So there are people now who identify...
What is RQ?
RQ is rational quotient.
Rational quotient.
And rational quotient. And they say it's distinct from IQ, and they say it's the capacity for questioning your own assumptions and questioning your own arguments, and steel manning, the capacity for steel manning and the propensity for steel manning is a very clear indicator of somebody that has a high RQ. And so it's possible in the sort of Jesuit tradition or lawyerly tradition, it's possible to have a very high IQ but a very low RQ. This is why you can meet people who are very devoutly religious and they're clearly highly intelligent, but they believe crazy things, right? And because they're not ever questioning their assumptions, right? So that's there's a number of other things I wanted to talk to you about. Politically, a lot of people who've read your book have said that your teachings would lead to apathy, and that it's just very depressing and very cynical, and that if everybody were to adopt your stance toward politics, then it would be terrible. I mean, how do you respond to that?
I get up in the morning.
It's the whole Kantian thing. If everybody were to do thus, how would the world look? If everybody were to become like Aaron Haspel tomorrow, how would that work out?
Well, what about becoming like Aaron Haspel in particular? What is it exactly that I'm supposed to be advocating that, if universally applied, not that I think the Kantian, universalizing is such a great procedure, but even if we adopt that procedure, what is it that I do that, if it were universally adopted, would be so terrible and would lead to, widespread apathy or the end of the world or anything like that?
Well, for instance, aphorisms like there's always just two parties, the ins and the outs.
Right.
Everything else is advertising.
Right.
That would lead people to say, well, they're all the same. It doesn't matter.
Right.
Choose one of the. And if people were to go along with that, you would have voter turnout would go down. I'm just giving you the argument that voter turnout would go down, and this would be terrible. And we've all heard all that is necessary.
Voter turnout would
evil to prevail
is
for good men to do nothing.
Well, as opposed to what? I'm not advocating doing nothing.
Well, what are you advocating?
Minding your own business. I mean, it's simple enough. Okay, it's I have a business. I'm not an aphorist by trade. No one, including La Rochefoucauld, has managed to make a living from aphorism. But there's all kinds of stuff you can do. I have a business, selling commercial software, scheduling software to construction companies. Lots of construction companies need these things. They have a lot of complicated resources to keep track of. I do that thing for them. There's nothing about my political stance that prevents me from getting up in the morning and running my business and doing a better job for my clients so they can schedule better so we can get projects built more efficiently. What's wrong with that? How is that doing nothing?
Yeah, I guess I
Right?
see that.
Why,
Uh,
why, why, why must doing something always be some sort of political action? In fact, doing something is rarely some sort of political action. And usually, when it is some sort of political action, the consequences are disastrous.
yeah, well,
I mean, the Russian Bolsheviks certainly did something, whatever else you can say. They
well, I know
wound,
this is. I grew up with
wound up killing people.
apathy is
Wound up
boring
killing
and all
people
these
in
movements.
the eight figures, but they did something, right?
They did something. That's true. The argument you make is somewhat similar to what Jason Brennan makes in Against Democracy. He says that there's all these people say apathy is boring and you need to get political and all that stuff. And he says the result of this is actually that people end up becoming much more angry at each other, and it creates all these divisions that don't need to be there. And he says the political system, the political party system, gives you all sorts of reasons to hate your neighbor that you wouldn't have had before then because of the sort of winner take all way that it's all laid out. I mean, what do you think about that?
I'm inclined to agree with Jason. I mean, I think he's got a point that way. Obviously, anybody who spent any time on Facebook, okay, can hardly deny that politics does tend to lead to bad feelings and creates a lot of enemies. But here's the great irony where politics is concerned. People talk about doing something. It's always doing something, doing something. Don't be apathetic. Get out there and do something. Do something. But really, when it comes to politics, they're not interested in doing anything at all. What they're interested in is showing something, and that is entirely different. These arguments on Facebook are all about tribal affiliations for the most part, and I'll tell you how you can tell.
Okay.
If you want to do something in politics, you know where you do it?
Where?
Locally. You do it on your block. You do it in your neighborhood. You do it in the local PTA. If you actually get involved in politics at this level, there are changes that you can make that will affect your and your neighbors' daily lives, serious changes. Anybody who wants to change the world through politics, that's how he does it. In general, the higher the level of politics you go, the higher up the chain you go. If you go to state politics and you go to national politics and international politics, the less influence you are likely to have on your daily lives for all kinds of reasons. One of which is that, once people get in office that way, they've already had all their edges filed off by the system and they become part of the system rather than, any sort of effective change in the system. There are a million reasons this is the case. But you will notice that nobody ever talks or writes about local politics in Facebook, ever. It's always national politics.
They do in Montreal.
Rarely compared to what I'm talking about. I mean, in Montreal, it seems to me that people are more interested in Trump and in American politics than they are in Canadian politics, let alone local Montreal politics. There may
that's true.
There may be some of that, okay, but the reason people spend all their time talking about national politics and international politics is that that's where alliances are formed. That's where the tribal divisions lie. And what politics talk is all about and has always been about is affiliating with your tribe. So really nobody's doing anything at all. All they're doing is affiliating with their tribe.
Okay. I'm just going to pivot for a minute. I want to make sure that I remember to do this. As a number of sort of guests and sort of listeners who've asked me questions that they wanted me to ask you during the podcast. So the first question.
Questions from the audience already?
Yeah, already, yeah. Well, they've been coming in, right? So one of them, this is from Sid Parkinson.
Okay.
He says, okay, who in your opinion, he's addressing this to you, who in your opinion is the best aphorist, the most important aphorist, and the most influential aphorist?
All right. So these are all supposed to be completely different people, at least in theory. Or I
No,
suppose they could all be the same people.
He says, of course, they could be the same person, but he'd have to justify that call.
I say. The best aphorist, in my opinion, is probably Karl Kraus. Karl Kraus doesn't get much of a reputation in English, and the main reason is that his German is highly elusive and it's quite difficult to translate. But there are a few of them that translate very well into English, so I'll just give you one so you have some idea of what we're dealing with Kraus. Kraus is a Viennese. He lived around the turn of the century with Freud, Vienna, and all sorts of people. Okay, yeah,
I mean, a very exciting time to be there.
Yeah, it's people ask me where and when I would go if I could go any place and anywhere in the past, and I always choose Vienna right before the First World War because you have Freud and Adler and Kraus and Musil and Popper and Klimt and
it would have been amazing.
The list just goes on. It was an absolutely fabulous time, and then World War I came, and civilization more or less came to an end.
Yeah, and we mainly know about the sort of the first class thinkers of the time, but for them to exist, there must have been phenomenal second and third class thinkers there too.
I mean, you had guys like Altenburg and just a whole cafe society in Vienna. I mean, one of the interesting things about cafe society in Vienna is it's glamorized now, but one of the reasons that it was so prevalent there is that the housing was terrible, okay, and the rents were so high that a lot of these people basically lived in cafes, okay. It was like the only place you could go. So, that's how you get coffee house society. Anyway, Vienna in 1900 had Freud, and it also had Freud's most trenchant critic, who was Kraus. And one of the things Kraus said about, he had many amazing things to say about psychiatry, but possibly my favorite is the madman can be infallibly detected by his agitation upon being incarcerated. Yeah, exactly.
Circular argument.
Exactly. All right, but you heard that argument made in almost those terms for decades after Kraus. And Kraus wrote this in, something like 1905. So I would say that Kraus is probably my favorite. Another one of my favorites, and he should always get a mention, is Lord Halifax, the otherwise known as the Trimmer, who lived in Charles II time in the late 17th century. Halifax was actually a diplomat, very much a man of state, but he wrote aphorisms on the side. His maxims of state are classics. There may be 100 or 200 that he wrote, but he almost never wrote a bad one. So those are my favorites. Now, what were the other two questions?
I'm surprised La Rochefoucauld didn't make it on your list.
Well, La Rochefoucauld, of course, does make it on the list, but I would rate La Rochefoucauld after these two, and the reason is that La Rochefoucauld essentially has only one subject, and that subject is vanity and self-love. Now, it's a great subject, and you can get an entire career out of that. But after La Rochefoucauld's maybe 20 or 30 best aphorisms, he's more or less repeating himself. But his 20 or 30 best are probably as good as they ever get. Okay, it's just I don't think I will ever write anything as good as Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. That's just so on the money that there's really you can't improve on that. Or every man has the strength to bear the misfortunes of his neighbor. Okay, yeah, is another classic. But as you can see, these two are both on a single subject, and that's really La Rochefoucauld's one subject. Great subject, but that's why I can't rank him at absolutely the very top. So, what was the third part of the question?
The third part of the question was, let's see,
Who's the
it
most
says, so
important?
what's the one you like the most?
Right.
What's the one who says the most important things? And who's the one who has had the biggest impact?
He's had the biggest impact. Wow, that's a tough one. Uh, well, probably some Greek, okay, just because they've been around for that long. Probably, I mean, if you have to think about it, all right, Heraclitus has probably had more influence than any other aphorist. Of course, Heraclitus is an aphorist, by necessity, because we've lost something like 98% of what he was supposed to wrote is supposed to have written. So
Mm-hmm.
all we have is a few sentences. Okay, but has there ever been an aphorism with more influence than "you can never enter the same stream twice"?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, probably
Right.
not.
I think Epicurus had a lot of aphorisms that, in terms of their, regardless of whether you like them or not,
Right,
they spread a lot. I mean, like, for instance, an expression which you can find in all sorts of European languages: "A pleasure shared is a pleasure doubled," right? Which is Epicurus, and that's a really interesting thought, right? That like Epicurus would say, you should never eat alone,
right,
right? You should try and share things with other
right.
people, right?
No,
That's
absolutely.
I don't know.
Absolutely. Okay. I think probably a better question, if I may correct Sid's question, which is kind of obnoxious, but maybe a better question than who's the aphorist who said the most important things is or the most influential things is what are the most influential aphorisms? And I would say probably most influential aphorisms come from the Greek, either from the Greek or from the classic period of the French, like Chamfort and Vauvenargues and La Rochefoucauld, including the couple that I quoted there. Those are highly influential.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, what Nietzsche would say, and sort of like, what would Nietzsche do? I think Nietzsche would say that Jesus was one of the most important aphorists. He would probably say Muhammad as well, and that they, the sayings, the pithy sayings, have sort of filtered into the various cultures in ways that people aren't even aware of.
Right.
The whole idea of the last shall be first, right? First shall be last, and all these things. Blessed are the meek. These sort of, those things have had a very big effect, regardless of whether you think it's good or not.
Oh, I steal from Matthew all the time.
That's a good thing to steal from. I
it's one of my
I
it's
do
one, it's one of my
actually.
favorite sources. Yeah.
There's one parallel that I've always found really interesting between your work and a lot of the sort of great religious
Uh huh.
traditions, right? So, the what you basically see, this is a sort of a gross simplification, but in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam as well, one of the main messages is you suck, right? You're not as good of a person as you think you are. You're not as nice as you think you are. You're not as smart as you think you are, and you get the feeling that they're always trying to sort of knock you down a couple of pegs to give you, and the the indication seems to be that if you want to be a good person, if you want to be intelligent and wise, that involves a self-correction in the direction of lowering your estimation of yourself. Right now, this goes very much counter to the kind of child rearing and the uh, sort of zeitgeist that I grew up with, which is the whole self-esteem thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can do
Right.
anything.
Right.
You're the
Right.
best, right? And positive
Sure.
thinking, which says that you should. So I'm wondering, what do you think about that? Is that intentional, or is
Well, it's very much
in your own
no, it's
work?
it's yeah, it's very much intentional. The I think I'm quite explicit about this in one of my aphorisms, which is not in this book, but will probably make it into the next one, which is most of us believe in God to remind ourselves that we are not He. And and God essentially is just another term for epistemic modesty. Now, you could sort of make a chicken egg argument here where religions are concerned. It's like, which came first, the God or the epistemic modesty? Okay, do we preach epistemic modesty to make room for God, or do we devise God because, we are attempting to preach epistemic modesty? But when it comes down to it, it doesn't really matter, because epistemic modesty is the result, and that is a very useful result. In fact, I would argue that that's the one great personal quality that is, in fact, inculcated by religion. People have argued endlessly about whether religion inculcates virtue and whether religious people are more virtuous. But I don't really think that's the point. I think, oddly enough, religious people are more realistic. Okay. Now, of course, the religion myth itself is a myth, but the religion myth isn't really the point. The whole point of the religion myth is that it causes you, to a certain degree, to be more modest about your own faculties, and that makes your judgment in areas outside of religion a little more accurate.
Yeah, that's a interesting idea. I guess because that's one of the things that a lot of people, students who've read your book, have taken away. I remember seeing you in a public talk you gave, and somebody, a young person, asked you at the end of your talk, said, if you could summarize the message of your book, everything, in one phrase, what would you're remembering this? You said, how would you summarize your book? And your response was absolutely hilarious. You said, "You suck so much more than you know."
Right. Right.
Would you care to elaborate?
Well, you do. You do. We all do. And it's almost certain that you're going to, overestimate your own capacities. Everybody overestimates their own capacities, right? You can see this in a very simple form where, something like 90% of the population thinks it's an above average driver, right? Or, the old, no, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but it really is something like that. And, or the old joke about, Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average, right? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay.
All the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.
That's right. And, and of course, everybody thinks this. Okay. And the funny thing about it is that the more aware you are that this is not the case and that everybody else is that way, the more convinced you are in your heart of hearts that you yourself are in fact the exception, and that sure, everybody else is deluded, but that doesn't really apply to you. All right.
Which is one of your aphorisms is like, the Dunning-Kruger effect is most pronounced in people
who know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. Right. Okay. Or, or I put it more broadly in another aphorism where I say to regard oneself as the exception is the rule.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the rule is, in your heart of hearts, okay, in the back of your mind somewhere, you are sure that you are the exception to that rule. Which is why I'm completely convinced that whatever the student may have said or may have thought when I told him he sucks so much more than he knows, all right, he immediately went out of class and he said, "Nah, I don't really suck more than I know." He was just playing it for laughs, okay? But, the rest of the class, they suck.
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist in The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, he argues that he sees he's an atheist himself, but he has a great deal of respect for religion. And he says that religion is a kind of cultural technology.
So am I, incidentally.
No, I know. Which is why the comments on your aphorisms are sometimes hilarious, where people are like, "Well, this is kind of smart, but I don't believe in God." Right. So,
right.
But Jonathan Haidt says that religion is a kind of cultural technology which allows us to overcome certain cognitive limitations that we have. And he says we have this tendency to be much more judgmental of other people and to sort of undervalue other people's sort of qualities and contributions and character, and to overvalue our own. And this leads to self-righteousness, which leads to conflict between individuals and between groups and all of these things. So he says anything that can reduce that self-righteousness will be good for the individual, good for the group. And so this is his argument for why religion is a fantastic thing. And I think your aphorisms very much do the same thing. However, as I said, it's a tough sell in this particular cultural climate. Right?
Well,
so, for instance,
I think that's really I think that's the secondary value of religion. It's an important benefit of religion, but it's not the most important benefit. The most important benefit of religion is that it allows you to affiliate with people outside of your tribe. Mm-hmm. That's right. This was the very first great benefit of religion. Okay. It allowed you to affiliate with and to cooperate with people who are strangers to you because they profess a shared belief. And this is actually one of the reasons that the religious stories in which you are supposed to believe are so ridiculous, because the more ridiculous the story is, the better a sign it is that you are, in fact, a member of the group when you profess belief in it.
Because it costs you something.
That's right. The church, that's right.
Sad. I believe it because it's absurd.
Yes. The church father, Tertullian, notoriously said, credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. Mm-hmm. Now, this is widely misinterpreted, okay? People say, oh, well, Tertullian, this is just irrationalism right there. I mean, if you were Steven Pinker, okay, you would look at this and say, oh, this is the very definition of irrationality. But of course, it's really not, okay, because what Tertullian is saying is that it's the fact that the story is absurd that makes the belief necessary, and it's the belief that produces the affiliation.
Well, I mean, you could say the same thing for all sorts of political positions.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be politics. It's the same reason that people in prison get face tattoos. Okay, because it costs you something. It is a signal that is extremely difficult to counterfeit. Okay.
Yeah,
and it stems from the same rationale, which is to denote that you are, in fact, a committed member of the group, whatever that group is.
Well, if you look at Trump, one of the ways in which he developed his base, aside from his reality TV show, was by, advocating birtherism, which is just one of the most absurd positions. And, a lot of people have said that this is an example of, the fact that he's irrational or he's racist or various other explanations. But if you look at it from the perspective we're talking about right now, taking a really absurd position that is going to automatically turn off a whole bunch of people, like it's just those people are not available to you now, that is costly signaling, which from a strategic standpoint worked for him. If you try and look at it beyond good and evil in a Machiavellian sense, right? Just looking at is this a successful strategy or not? Taking a really absurd position like that can have some benefits in a weird way.
Was it successful? How was it successful for him? I'm not sure I'm following the argument here.
Because it sent a clear message to far right elements that this guy's serious. This guy's willing to sign on to propositions that are going to make him ineligible for dinner. He's not going to be a dinner party guest. He's not going to be a part of polite society by taking a position like that.
But didn't he repudiate that position later?
He didn't so much repudiate it. He was on Stephen Colbert, and Stephen Colbert asked him about it. This was in the, I don't know, late in the election campaign, really close to the election. And he didn't repudiate it. He just said, "Oh, I'm not going to stress that anymore. I'm, I'm not going to talk about that much anymore. I want to talk about jobs and the economy and
Okay.
other things, keeping us safe and the wall." So he didn't exactly repudiate it, but that was to a lot of people an absolutely insane position to take. I mean, way more than climate denial or things like that. I mean, there's ways in which people can make sense of that, but the birtherism thing is just straight out wacky. It's like saying the lizard people are running everything, or I mean, it's anyway. I wanted to ask another one of the questions from the
Okay.
audience, and this is from Sean Ryan, and he says, "Does Aaron Haspel ever have anything positive to say about anything ever?" So, how do you respond
No.
to that? Is this
Come on. I
because
mean,
you need some serotonin reuptake inhibitors?
that's clearly nonsense. Didn't I just say something very positive about religion?
You
All
did
right.
indeed. You did indeed. And you've said very nice things about markets as well. And
Sure.
you talked
There are
about
lots of things I like. I have great things to say about, going out in the world and starting your own business and, minding the store. I have a lot to be. I spent a good, I don't know, 5 minutes earlier in this podcast in praise of that. Okay. There are a great many things I praise. What I dispraise is the sort of stuff that people spend all kinds of time praising. And the reason I dispraise most of this stuff is that the people who praise it are not so much interested in praising it as they are interested in being seen praising it. And that's a completely different thing.
So it'd be sort of like making sure to be seen in church or be seen as being a member of a particular group, but you don't really. Church is probably not a good example because you actually have to get up on
Yeah.
Sunday
You have to get your
morning
ass
and
out
go.
of bed, to get your ass out of bed and get it into the pew.
I guess
right?
maybe it would
right.
be like
We're
putting a Bible on the mantle or putting a cross on your wall just to, in a very religious area, to signal that you're a member of the tribe, but you don't really do anything
or
else.
post
Right?
on Facebook. It's a very
Yeah.
common way of doing that. But yeah, I mean, that's essentially one of the key points I want to take away. All right. I dispraise behavior that I regard as just signaling behavior. And
But how do you tell the difference between the
most of
two?
most of what you see in public is like that. All right.
Okay. But how would you tell the difference between the sort of the genuine and right the fake? Like, how do you know what is virtue signaling and what is, well, actual signaling that you do possess these virtues and these right? How do you tell the difference?
Pretty much anything you do in public is going to be virtue signaling in one sense or another. And this is why most of what I regard as virtuous behavior is just completely hidden behavior. I don't know anything about most of the people that I know only through Facebook because all I know is what they choose to show me on Facebook. I don't know what they're like in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There are essentially only two ways to know what someone is really like. There are only two ways. All right. And neither one of them has anything to do with social media. All right. The first way is to do business with them. And the second way is to marry them. Those are pretty much your only choices. So when it comes to making judgments about people, the only people whom I can really judge are people with whom I've done business or the one person to whom I've been married. That's about it. Nobody else I can really judge with any degree of accuracy at all.
Well, I find you can sometimes I mean, there's always a gap between what people say and what they do. I think that's sort of inevitable for all
It's
sorts
not
of
a
obvious
question.
reasons.
It's
But
not a question. It's not a
sometimes the
question of
gap
no.
is
It's not a question of
ridiculous.
gap. A gap implies that there's some relationship between the two. A gap implies that you're trying to put one into line with the other and you haven't quite succeeded. But if you try just a little harder, you're going to get there. That's what a gap implies. It's not a gap at all, okay? It's a complete
Okay.
divergence, all right? You do one thing and then you say something else that's completely different. The things that people say about politics, okay, have absolutely nothing to do with the way they conduct their daily lives. Nothing. Literally nothing. Okay? There's no gap because, as I say, a gap implies a relationship. The relationship does not exist.
I find with some people it
Yeah?
does exist that if they're committed to, I don't know, let's say rationality, they will be like that in their sort of political arguments. They'll be like that in
What
the way that
does
they
what
parent their
does
kids. They'll be like
what
that
does
in
committed to rationality even mean?
committed to sort of rational discussion of things and to proper argument etiquette and trying to convince people with evidence and arguments as opposed to just saying it's so because I say it's so. And I've seen people who are really into rationality in the way that they parent. It's kind of laughable actually, but because they're trying to reason with a 5-year-old, but they it definitely is
It's hard to
filtering into
imagine
their.
anything less reasonable than trying to reason with a 5-year-old.
Well, that's true. Okay, another question. This comes from Brent in Michigan, Brent Halonen. He says, Aaron, how serious are you about replacing the education system with child
Oh, I'm
labor?
completely in earnest. I am absolutely in earnest.
So, why would you replace education with
Well, because
child
you learn
labor?
something on the job. You actually have to you on a job, there's real accountability to someone for something. Okay. Ultimately, all right, if you're at a job, it means you're making that is making something that someone is paying for, or contributing to making something that someone is paying for. That's what it is to work. That's real work. Someone else has a preference and you're trying to fill that preference as best you possibly can. You have none of this in school. School offers you none of this. There's no accountability in school. It's simply a matter of pleasing the teacher so you can get the appropriate grade, whatever it is. Whatever it is that such and such person wants, that's what you give them. Okay? And this is there's no ultimate accountability because, the whole system is all bought and paid for anyway. Now, people say apparently one of the great triumphs of modern education has been the skyrocketing literacy rate. Okay, everybody knows how to read now. Okay, and this is yeah, and we're supposed to attribute this in some way to the glorious doings of the public school system. All right, but why should the literacy rate be 99.9%? Is there some particular reason it should be 99.9%? Why shouldn't it be 98%? Why are you going to make people sit in school and teach them how to read if they don't want to learn how to read?
Well, because they would have to be able to program their computer so they could watch Netflix.
You think?
I don't know.
Okay, well, then they teach themselves how to read, right? And the reason they teach themselves how to read is that, otherwise they wouldn't be able to watch the movies they want to watch. You have to read the titles, right? So, you have to read that much stuff. Seriously, think about it. Essentially what you're doing, okay, is you're taking an entire class of people, okay, and you're saying to them from the age of 6, to the age of about 17 or so, it is mandatory for you to be in jail from 9 to 3, 5 days a week. This is what you're saying to people. All right? And yet this is universally regarded as a good thing. How could it be otherwise? What could possibly be better than this?
Well, at the moment when you have both parents working, right, they're gone all day. Sort of, what else are you going to do with the kids? I mean, where are they going to go? Like, it's. I mean, you see this all the time when kids have ped days and during the summers, and parents are scrambling to figure out like what to do with their kids. Like, somebody has to look after them.
Yeah, maybe both parents shouldn't be working. Maybe it shouldn't be like that. Okay, I mean, obviously, because this is in fact a form of social engineering. Because what it is, okay, is it's, babysitting for the day for these children. This is what it is. It is babysitting for the day. And therefore, both parents are at loose ends. And if they want to do something other than raise the children, then they are free to do something other than raise the children. Okay. This is federally enforced babysitting. That's what schooling is. All right. And that's what it is for, 11 or 12 years. And believe me, okay, I may be old now, but I'm still young enough to remember how people regarded school. People did not regard a school as a place where you learned or a place where you made friends or anything good at all, okay? The way children regarded school was as jail. Jail. Okay, this is what it was.
But you've said that jail is the best place.
It is the best place for a writer. Because you have nothing else to do but write. All right? But that doesn't mean it's the best. But that doesn't mean it's the best place for every child in the country.
Yeah. Well, despite all the sort of criticisms you have of the education system, I find it interesting that you nevertheless say that there are some very good reasons to go to college anyway. Can you sort of tell us what those are?
Oh, sure. There are all kinds of
the good reasons to go to college.
Well, all right. I can't speak for Canada, and I won't speak for Canada, but I can speak for America. In America, if you want to hire someone for a job, unless it's a programming job or unless it's something that's really directly related to IQ, you can't test them. In other words, you're not allowed to test people's IQs in America, job applicants. You're not allowed to do that.
I don't think you can do that here.
It's not legal? Well, that's too bad.
Well, I don't know. I've never heard of anybody being tested, having their IQ tested.
That's too bad.
A job.
You know why? Because IQ is by far, the single best predictor of job performance for just about any job. Not necessarily.
So you disagree a lot with Nassim Nicholas Taleb because he says IQ is complete, bullshit. He doesn't have anything nice to say about. He says IQ tests were created by a certain kind of people so that they would sort of feel smart, right? And he says George W. Bush has a very high IQ.
Taleb's problem is that on this point anyway, is that he's looking at the extremities of IQ, which makes sense because, most of his thought is about the extremes and fat tails and things like that. And IQs are normally distributed. The fact is, okay, within 2 deviations, either up or down of the mean, IQs are very reliable for predicting all kinds of things. They predict grades in school. They predict job performance. They predict your ability to stay out of jail. They predict your ability to stay off welfare. They predict your income to a great degree. They predict all of these things. Okay? So they're really extremely useful. All right. Now, obviously, once you get more than 2 or 3 deviations out, then all bets are off and it gets a little flaky. And that's what Taleb is talking about. And I understand that. I take his point. But the fact remains that 2 deviations from the mean accounts for 93% of the population. And that's a really big chunk. And for 93% of the population, okay, IQ is an excellent indicator of what's going to happen to you in life, a far better indicator than anything else.
So how does this tie into
I was
reasons
just
to go to
getting to that.
college?
If you can't test for IQ, then you got to figure out another way of testing for IQ if you're an employer. You got to figure out how smart your charges really are. And you can't do that in job interviews because job interviews are just notoriously unreliable and flaky, and you just can't really do it. All right. So the best way to do it is by figuring out where someone went to college. Because college is a very reliable method of IQ sorting. Because because for white people, at least, whites and Asians, what it is extremely, let me see how I can put this. Okay, the higher your IQ, almost the better a school you went to. So all you have to do is look at the school rank, and you can infer from that school rank approximately what the IQ of the person you're going to hire is. Of course, you get it wrong a little bit around the edges. It's not as reliable a signal as IQ itself, but it's a pretty reliable signal, and this is what people use. Okay, so oddly enough, the refusal to allow employers to test for IQ is one of the greatest subsidies that college can imagine. Because now, now college is the IQ test. College is the way you sort your applicants by where they went to school. You actually thought.
So if somebody graduates from
That's right,
Harvard
or Stanford,
smart,
or Princeton, or Yale, which is why the investment bankers who pretty much do hire for IQ will only interview from certain schools. If you aren't from one of those schools, you don't even get in the door. You think they don't know what they're doing? You don't think there are reasons for that?
Yeah. Well, there could be other reasons. I mean, if you only recruit from those schools, then you're recruiting from people who are more likely to be affluent and are more likely to be directly related to people who have money to invest, which, this becomes a kind of, right, it's helpful. You're not only hiring a very competent employer, you're hiring and all of their connections and all of their social networks and things like that. I mean, I can imagine other reasons why you might want to hire somebody from an elite school, which would be not necessarily. I mean, you see this in that show Mad Men, right, where they talk about how who's that one young guy they have on the show. He's kind of annoying. I can't remember his name, but at one point, the Don Draper is talking to one of the partners, the owners, and he says, why do you have this guy around? He's
Pete Campbell. Pete Campbell, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, the guy. He said, we have him. He said, we have him because of his last name and because just having him associated with our firm adds to our prestige. So they're not saying Pete Campbell is himself a particularly brilliant or gifted, but he comes with a whole bunch of connections, and it raises the status of our firm in important ways.
If that were the case, then what you would see is Goldman Sachs and the rest of the investment banks hiring. I'm not even sure which ones are even still around. So otherwise I'd list some other names. But what you would see is the investment banks hiring people who are not only from these schools, but who also tend to be disproportionately wealthy and disproportionately legacy from these schools. And that's not the case.
Well, it has been the case. There's an article I read recently. It was all about law firms. And it was saying that in Canada, and I imagine that the same thing has been happening in the United States, but it said in Canada, the people in law schools used to come from a broad range of class backgrounds into law firms and into law schools and then into law firms. And it said that that's been narrowing a great deal in the last 2 decades. And so now the people who are getting into law schools, especially the really good law schools, are almost exclusively from the people who are quite wealthy, like people who are in the, I can't remember exactly what their cutoff was, but that there's much less sort of class diversity of the people who are going into law schools, and that they thought this was sort of a troubling trend because the law was one of those professions that was a way for a smart kid from the inner city or a smart kid from some small little hick town in the country to
Right.
make good, right? I mean, I think I wasn't very convinced by the argument that the article made about why this is happening. It seems to me like what David Brooks says is much more plausible. He says that right now the elite, for the most part, they are out competing everybody else, like fair and square. Their kids are in extracurricular activities constantly. They have no life. They're actually, much smarter and much better prepared to compete in a meritocratic environment. So he says it's not class prejudice per se that's leading to them to be more successful. It's because they actually are better most of the time, right? Which is
no.
horrible.
They are better at competing in environments that are more like school. A law firm, that's right. A law firm is like school. An investment bank is like school. You have these teachers, these senior people who give you your assignments, and you have to do this assignment diligently, and you have to hand in the assignment to the senior player who grades you on the assignment, and if he is happy with your work and takes a fancy to you personally, then you move up the ranks and you get little gold stars. It is like school.
That's very true. Yeah. It's interesting because if you contrast it to medicine, I was talking to a friend of mine who teaches in the medical school at McGill, and he said, it's completely perverse right now because he said it's incredibly competitive to get into a top medical school like at McGill University. So you have these students that are kind of selected for being absolutely ruthless and very, very competitive to the point of, actually trying to sabotage and undermine other students in order to be successful and come out on top. And then they graduate and they go out into the medical profession. And guess what? That is not a very... Those people are horrible to work with because when you get into the profession, you have to work with other people. You have to collaborate. You have to be able to... And so they have all these incredibly maladaptive sort of behaviors and ways that have been bred from an early age.
School is a very bad model for most of the useful activity in the world. But the reason it's a good model for what goes on in law firms and investment banks is that in law firms and investment banks, there are only a few people. You start with it's a pyramid, right? Okay, so you start with a very large class of associates, young associates, and then they get whittled down, and only a few make partner at the end. And everybody who starts knows this, and as a consequence, it breeds that kind of ruthlessness and that kind of just claws out all the time for your fellows.
It's interesting. My friend Alex is working for a company. He's been in sales for most of his adult life, and he said he's worked in companies that have the North American model, which is usually very heavy on the commissions and on kind of rewarding individual success a great deal. But now he's working for a German company, and he said it's very different because they work as a group. So there's the Canadian sales team, and they have a number of offices in a few different cities in Canada, and they get their bonuses and their commissions as a team. And he said it has all these, at first he was very skeptical of this, but he said it has all these amazing effects. So before, when you were constantly in other companies he's been in, where you're always Montreal's trying to compete with Toronto, which is trying to compete with Vancouver and Calgary. So let's say you have a bunch of stuff in stock and you're in Calgary. you don't want to like give it to Toronto when they call you up and say we've got a big order, can you send us the stuff you have in stock? You have incentives to not do that because that helps them and hurts you. Whereas when you're working as a team, the idea is let's put up some amazing sales numbers, and everybody really helps each other to. And he said they are actually out competing their competitors who have a different model, right? Which he said he thought was he did not think that would be the result at all. He thought the opposite would be the result. That this would sort of lead to people free riding and being lazy and stuff like that. So yeah, it's one of those problems. So I'm taking a lost track. So back to college.
Oh yes,
back to school. Why should my students
Well, the first reason, as
college?
I say, is so your employers can measure your IQ. Now, what this means is that you'd better get into a good school, because if you don't get into a good school, this reason becomes a detriment. It becomes a reason not to go to college. The second reason is when you go to college, you make a lot of friends, meet a lot of new people, make a lot of contacts. And many of these friends and contacts and new people, and of course their parents, will be potentially very valuable to you in later life. In general, the people you meet as a young person are going to be more helpful to you. Anybody you meet at 20 is going to be more helpful to you than you meet at 40. The binding is tighter and you just have more time. So this is really the first opportunity that many of these people have to meet relatively rich, relatively influential people outside of their own narrow sphere, outside of their own community. And they should take maximum advantage of that. Now,
so this is almost like sort of somewhat akin to religion. It's creating these super tribes, right? These
alumni association.
People that are not,
Exactly. Now, there is an interesting corollary to this that many people are unwilling to draw, which is that if this is what matters about college, then it is much more important to spend your time socializing than it is to spend your time studying.
That just reminded me of another question you got at the end of
because after all,
you said you said hang out with your friends and go out.
That's right. That's right. You don't make friends in the library, right? You know, you have your whole life to study. You can always stay home and read books. There's no hurry in that regard. On the other hand, you know, this is a golden opportunity to socialize with and associate with a lot of people whom you would not otherwise get a chance to associate with. There's another corollary to this too, which, you know, bears on the point that you were making a little earlier, John, when, we talk about rich people at fancy schools. Obviously, fancy schools have more rich and influential people. So here again, it is extremely important that you get into the best, fanciest school that you possibly can, because the Alumni Association at Stanford or Harvard is going to be a lot more valuable to you than the Alumni Association at Eastern Kentucky University. Okay? And that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. So that's really the second reason. The third reason is a real reason, but it's a relatively minor reason, and it's the one that everybody's parents tell you all the time, which is that you go when you work hard and you graduate and you get a degree. And now there's some truth in that. Okay? A lot of employers are interested in people who will be compliant cogs in their machine. And one way to see if someone is willing to be a compliant cog is to see if he has graduated college, or if, God forbid, he's not only graduated college, but
so college is one big marshmallow test?
Sort of. I mean, if he's acquired advanced degrees, so much the better. But essentially, what this measures is your willingness and ability to do work that you find dull and unpleasant. And a lot of the working world, especially in school-like environments, like law firms and like investment banks, all right, A lot of the working world consists of doing work that you find dull and unpleasant. And if you have done this work, shown by the fact that you've not only graduated college, but graduated with good grades, then it's very likely that you are willing to do this work for an employer. This is why.
Okay, so it's almost like
Well,
hazing,
it's
right?
not,
If you're willing to go through, you can get
it's
in
sort
the
of,
fraternity if you're willing to run around in
but
your underwear.
it's not like hazing because, once you run around in your underwear, okay, you're probably not going to be asked to do that again. Yet in college, okay, if you have to put in all these term papers and then you go to an investment bank and you become an analyst, okay, you're going to be asked in essence to do the same thing that you did in college over and over and over and over again. And that's why for these school-like environments in particular, okay, college is a very good indication of whether you would succeed. Okay, so these are the 3 reasons to go to college. And what I should point out about them is that out of these 3 reasons, only the third, only the least important reason requires not only that you get good grades or even that you graduate at all.
It just demonstrates that you can sort of stick to something for a long time.
It demonstrates that you will be a cog in the machine. That is what it demonstrates.
Okay, another question I wanted to ask you, and this is not from a listener, this is one of mine, is interesting parallel I've always found between your thought and Nietzsche's thought is that you both stress the importance of surfaces and that we should pay a great deal of attention to superficial things, and we should be suspicious of sort of ideal things,
right,
things that are like sort of depths. Can you sort of explain what your rationale is?
Okay. If you read the great French novelists and 19th century novelists like Balzac in particular, this is what you see. Now, Balzac spends all of his time describing stuff like clothes and furniture and all these things that one would apparently consider superficial. But in fact, okay, they are not superficial. They are the essence of the person. All of the things with which one surrounds oneself, okay, these really become the essence of the person. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, what I mean is that we like to think that somewhere in our secret soul, okay, we've got some inviolable self or sense of self, all right, that is somehow untouched by the it's somehow untouched by the outside world. Yeah, my true self, my real soul. And you hear people talk about this stuff all the time. All right. Well,
he means well.
Deep down,
he's a really good person.
Deep down that. Okay. But the fact is, what we really are is just an accumulation of all of the things that we say and all the things that we do and all the clothes that we wear and houses and cars that we buy and all of these things, all of this detritus, okay? We accumulate just a giant stack, okay, of stuff and sayings and this and that, and this is all there is. If you take that away, all right, we're all alike. Yeah. There's nothing underneath. There's nothing there. There's no center. There's no core. Okay. All it is a screaming void. That's all there is at bottom. That's all your secret self is. There is nothing else.
Yeah. One of your harshest aphorisms is on this theme is, like when somebody does something terrible, right? They say, I'm not the kind of person that does this. That wasn't me. And your aphorism is, whatever you do,
yes, of course,
you are the kind of person that will do that.
Because what else is there? What else is there? Okay, actions. After all, what's on the surface?
Harsh.
What's most on the surface? On the surface, more than anything else, it is action. That's the surface. And that's what I, endeavor to make people to pay attention to. You pay attention to the surface, okay, and you let the depth take care of itself because, ultimately there really is no depth. Ultimately, depth is just a desire fact, that's a pretty good aphorism. How about this? Okay, what is depth? Okay, depth is the desire not to be judged on the surface. That's what depth is.
So don't judge a book by its
Yeah,
cover and
anyone
all that
anyone who
stuff, right?
considers himself a deep
Yeah.
person or fancies himself a deep person is simply saying, whatever you see, whatever I project to the world, whatever I show you, however I act, I don't want to be judged by that. I want to be judged by some other mysterious criterion, okay, that I can sort of like determine for myself and change at will.
Mm-hmm. So that's why. But would you say that there's advances in knowledge, besides just self-knowledge, that come from paying attention to surfaces, or are there some times when we
Advances,
should pay
and
attention to
I'm not
depth?
sure what the question means.
Well, it's just I trying to remember exactly how you put it, but I remember in one of your talks you talked about that Galileo and various advances in physics and in science also came when people started paying attention to the surface of things and to
Oh
how
yeah.
things
Okay. I mean, if we're talking
phenomenologically how
about
they
science,
look,
yes,
right?
there are the scientific questions are all surface questions. Science is all surface. It's not depth. Science is not, do rocks have an affinity for the ground? Science is, when you drop a rock out of a window and it's 300 feet above the ground, how long is it going to take before it hits the ground? And if it's 400 feet, how long is it going to take? And at what rate does it accelerate? And what is the terminal velocity? All of these things, these are surface questions. Every scientific question is a surface question. It is not a depth question. If you're asking yourself depth questions, you're not
Yeah.
in science land, you're in some other land. All right. When Galileo asks himself, okay, how is this ball going to behave when it rolls down the inclined plane? He's asking himself a scientific question. When Aristotle asks, okay, why is it that rocks fall to earth? He is not asking himself a scientific question. He's asking a depth question. That's an unscientific question fundamentally. Okay.
So it's
That,
going to
yes,
sort
yes,
of
science,
motivations and things like
the
that.
inner
So
life of the rock,
the
if in
inner
fact it
life of the
has an inner
rock.
life, and it may, for all I know, but the point is it doesn't matter. Okay, because we can see from the rock's
Mm-hmm.
action that whatever the inner life of the rock is, it's still going to accelerate when you drop it out of a window at 16 feet per second, okay, at sea level. This we know.
Yeah.
And we know this regardless of any speculation about the inner life of the rock. And this is true of human beings as well. The surface questions are the scientific questions. The depth questions are the bullshit questions.
Yeah. I remember seeing a very interesting sort of urban. I think it was urban archaeology, or it was, I can't remember what.
What is
It was a weird
what is
field, but
what is,
so what they
oh,
wanted to
I
do
know
is
what that
they
might
wanted
be,
to see.
because it's
Yeah, it was basic
obviously,
where they go
okay,
through they go through
a
garbage
city
dumps.
has layers and there's
Yeah,
stuff
and there was
like
this
buried
the
underneath. Yeah,
really
okay.
fast. Yeah, no, but this was okay. So here was what they did. They went to different neighborhoods and
Right.
different sort of suburbs and stuff like that, and they would first do a questionnaire where they would ask them, how important are environmental issues to you, right? And how important is
Mm-hmm.
recycling to you, and things like this, right? And then they would come up with data, and then they would go to the garbage dump, and they talk about horrible work, but they would go to the garbage dump and they would dig through all this garbage and see if there was a correlation between how much people say that they value the environment and recycling, and how much they actually recycle. And if I remember correctly, they found that there wasn't much of a difference. That so clearly people espousing environmental ethics and things like that didn't necessarily have much to do with whether they actually recycled. So lots of people who say that this is very important to them don't
Well,
actually
that may be a surprise to
do it,
you,
right? And
but did you hear what I said earlier about gap and divergence?
yeah, yes. Yeah, I mean, they
Uh
did
huh.
find some correlations, by the way. That there are some people
Right.
who recycle much more than others, but it doesn't seem to correlate very much to uh, to their politics and whether or not they say recycling is important to them. It tends to be people from certain countries, certain cultures, certain just for some reason seem to be much more fastidious about recycling and dealing with waste in a responsible way, like, and it doesn't really matter whether
Right.
they're right wing or left
Could you
wing
excuse
or
me for just a minute, John?
atheist or religious, right? So there
Thanks.
there are differences. Yeah.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Yeah,
No problem at
exactly.
all. We'll just edit that out. No, Sebastian will just delete it out. Okay, so I've got a couple cheeky questions
What if
from listeners
this
here.
reminds me of a
This one
line
is
in The
from.
Hustler, right? Okay, where George C. Scott, who's the big gambler, okay, goes to Paul Newman, the wannabe aspiring pool star after he's gotten way ahead of Minnesota Fats and blown his entire wad, okay. And so George C. Scott, sees him in a bar, buys him a drink, and starts talking to him about how he knew he was going to lose, and he's been a loser, okay, and this and that. He goes on in this vein for about, I don't know, 30 seconds or so, or a couple minutes, okay, and then he finally turns to Paul Newman. He says, "Eddie, that's the name of the character, Fast Eddie Phelps." He says, "Eddie, you mind if I get personal?" Okay, and, and Paul Newman says, "What have you been up to now?" Okay, so the same thing here. He asked me a cheeky question. I mean, what have you been up to now, right? All right.
Well,
What's the cheeky
gotta give
question?
the devil his due. First
Mm-hmm.
first question comes from Paul Bodie, and he says, many of Aaron Haspel's statements aren't meant to be taken seriously.
How does he
They're
know?
just meant to provoke angry responses. Does he see? I know. It says, does he see any similarities between
Between my
his
style
style
and
and
Trump's
Trump's
style?
style?
That is a rather cheeky question.
I guess he's basically saying,
Am
are
I
you a
am I a
troll? Are you just
provocateur?
trolling people?
No, no, I don't see it that way at
Yeah.
all. All right, I can say. I think I can say this. I think it's fair to say this. Okay, unless something's just an absolutely obvious joke. All right, I don't think I ever write something
Mm-hmm.
that I don't sincerely believe. And if you think I am writing things, that's right. That's right. I mean, the
In the
fact that I
moment when you're
believe it
writing it,
when I
at
write
least.
it does
Yeah.
not warrant that I'm going to believe it next week or next month. I may change my mind. And certainly I changed my mind about,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, a really
Yeah, you
bad mood,
might have been
okay.
in a
But
really
yeah,
good mood or really
certainly I
angry
wouldn't
that
write
day.
it
Yeah.
if I didn't
Yeah.
believe it. And if Paul thinks that, I am writing things deliberately to provoke or outrage or anything like that, I don't think that's really accurate. I will say that I don't write things. I know when I'm writing certain things that they will be provocative. And obviously, if they weren't provocative, then they would probably be pretty boring and there wouldn't be any sense in writing them. But the fact that I know that they will be provocative does not mean that I write them because they are provocative. I write them because I believe them.
Yeah. Well, I remember one of your aphorisms is, I ask one
Yeah.
thing of literature that it draw blood. So I wonder, what is the difference between literature that draws blood and literature that is deliberately clickbaity and provocative? And what's the difference there? Sebastian? We've lost the signal.
Go. I think we can go now.
Okay. So another cheeky question from a listener.
Well,
This
actually,
is
before you start that,
okay.
I was going to talk about drawing blood because you asked
Oh,
about
yes.
yeah,
Please.
you asked about drawing blood.
Mm-hmm.
To draw blood on someone is to tell the truth. That's essentially what I'm asking for. I'm asking that you tell the truth. And if the truth is harsh, then you're drawing blood. But if you're not telling the truth about someone, then you're drawing no blood at all.
Okay.
So the prerequisite to my requirement about literature is that you tell the truth about someone. And I sort of prefer harsh truths, which is to say, you draw blood. That happens to be my taste. But always, always, it is the truth you're telling. You're not just making something up. And when I talk about something in my aphorisms, I'm not just making things up. I'm not just trying to get a reaction. I'm not trying to make anybody angry or any of those things. Okay. I am simply trying to tell the truth as I see it. And the truth as I see it about many of these matters is controversial enough that it's going to make a lot of people angry. So lucky for me.
So be it, right?
Right.
Well, this is another question from a listener from J.L. Cooper. He says, I'd be interested to find out Aaron Haspel's take on reductionism in one sentence. He's thrown down the gauntlet, one aphorism to another, you might say.
That's cute. Reductionism in one sentence.
Yeah. Describe what you think of reductionism in one sentence, in one aphorism.
All right.
The gauntlet has been thrown down.
Reductionism is simply an opprobrious term for reduction. And reduction has its uses everywhere, like most things. So reductionism is simply a way of saying you've reduced things too far, or you've reduced things in a way I don't like.
Okay.
So I support reduction and I oppose reductionism. That's my take.
So reductionism a slur.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a slur for a process, reduction, which is absolutely necessary if you're going to do any thinking at all.
Because you have to derive things that are similar between case A and case B so that you can
have to
properly categorize.
Yeah, that's right. You have to filter out all of the details that are of no consequence to whatever it is you're trying to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Which is really actually a lot of what our brain does, and taking in sensory information is this incredible filtering process and deciding what to ignore, which is, by the way, practically everything. And you can see this when you're trying to do an audio recording in a crowded place and you can barely understand anything from the audio recording. But when you were in the crowded bar with the loud music, you could hear what the other person was saying perfectly. And it's because you were filtering out the ambient noise and just focusing on them, right? So, and we do this all the time without paying attention to it, right? But
sure, there's the Borges story about the guy who can't forget everything and sees everything and remembers everything and has it in his mind all the time. And of course he goes mad because there's nothing you can do with that. It's just, far, far too much stuff and you can't process it or do anything with it. So reduction is simply another word for thought. Reductionism is another word for thought we don't like.
Okay, that's good. Okay, the couple other things I wanted to ask you about. First of all, mold bug.
Yes.
Right? When I discovered this sort of phenomenon online, and I remember I sort of put out a message saying, "Hey, has anybody else heard of this mold bug guy?"
Mm-hmm.
You were one of a couple of dozen people who were put up your hand and said, "Oh yeah." So, what's your take on mold bug?
Oh, I know Curtis from way, way back. Back in the day, he and I would both comment on an arts blog known as Two Blowhards, which was great for a while, but is now defunct. And I think the archives are still online. You can still go read a bunch of stuff there. But Moldbug is, how does he characterize himself? He characterizes himself as a neo-reactionary. All right.
Okay.
And I guess that's a fair way to do it. I couldn't really do justice to his thought in 5 minutes on this podcast here. I guess the best way to put it is...
Well, take your time. I'm actually really interested in what you think his sort of value is. What are some of his fundamental insights that are something you're not likely to find elsewhere?
Yeah.
So what is a neo-reactionary? If you believe the mainstream media, a neo-reactionary is basically Steve Bannon, right? I mean, he's sort of been attached to this.
Yeah, but not really. I mean, a neo-reactionary is someone who believes that modern democracy is more or less a hopeless case, and that progressivism began with the Glorious Revolution in England in about 1688. And if we're going to revert to anything, we should revert back to, Charles I. Okay, the execution of Charles I, as far as Moldbug was concerned, was more or less the beginning of the end. Now, I don't know if I personally would go quite that far back. I would date it more to the French Revolution. I think the French Revolution is really the sort of rise of Demotism, okay, and the modern just you get to vote on everything, and that all dates really from the French Revolution. That's what we've had for the last 200 years. But Moldbug dates it back even further to the 17th century. Cromwell and William of Orange and the rest of that jazz in England. So neo-reactionism is essentially the objection to demonic government. And that is what he calls modern government. In other words, all the modern stuff that, that you get to vote on everything, the universal franchise, all of these things are absolute no-nos as far as Moldbug is concerned. And there's another way to look at it, which I think is a fair way to look at it. And that's from, what Taleb might call the skin in the game perspective, right? Ask yourself this. The problem with democracy, modern democracy fundamentally, is that you have a lot of people voting who have no interest in maintaining a reasonable, healthy polity. There was a reason when the franchise first started that it was restricted to property owners. There was a reason for this. And the reason wasn't just that, it's just the filthy white men who are just running roughshod over everybody. That wasn't the reason.
The reason was that you would have something to lose with the things went badly.
That's exactly right. The reason was so you would have a stake in the outcome.
Yeah, everybody's very generous with other people's money.
That's right. All right. And the wider the franchise, the more universal the franchise, all right, the more tempted citizens will be to vote themselves largesse out of other people's pocketbooks. This is what happens. And if you look at democracy and the history of democracy, you will see that, it very much goes along these lines. So I think the best way to characterize neo-reactionism and neo-reactionary thought in a sentence or two is that it's a way of giving government back to the people who really have a stake in proper governance. All right?
Okay.
Another idea that Moldbug has that's very fundamentally valuable is this. There are two ways of expressing yourself in the modern state. And Albert Hirschman, the political theorist, calls these voice and exit. Voice is, of course, what you would expect. Voice is things like, voting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I go to the ballot box and I cast my ballot, and that's how I have my stake in government. The problem with that is that my ballot doesn't affect anything whatsoever, and that even if it did affect something, once the person gets into office, I really have no control over him. Okay? Voice is, we can all agree, a not very effective way of exercising control over your rulers.
Well, it depends on what kind of options you're being provided with.
If
you're being provided with some serious options, then voice can be very good.
But you're never provided with serious options, because once you become a person who is not voting but who is voted on, your incentives do not do not incline in that direction. Okay, a much more useful way to keep the rulers in line is through exit, which is to say, if I don't like what you're doing, I will leave and I will prefer to be ruled by someone else.
So vote with your feet, basically.
That's right. Okay. And Moldbug's idea and the idea of neo-reactionary thought in general is that exit is what controls the state rather than votes. All right. What you've got is think of, instead of California, okay, think of, say, Apple running California.
Okay.
Think of California as a corporation. All right. If California were a corporation, you wouldn't be a stakeholder in California. Okay. You wouldn't be voting in California. You wouldn't be, ruled by California. You would be a customer of California, which is to say you would be a customer of the California corporation managed and run by Apple. And what this corporation would do is it would supply a bundle of services to you, kind of like cable TV, okay? Cable TV supplies you, TV, and maybe it supplies internet and supplies all these things. And if you don't like the cable company, you can, at least in theory, go to another cable company. In practice, maybe you can't really do that very readily, but in theory, at least you can do that. Or, you can go to the supermarket and you can buy a bunch of stuff and you can buy, all your goods and groceries for the week. And if you don't like that supermarket for whatever reason, you can go to some other supermarket around the corner. All right. Mm-hmm. This is what exit is. So what Moldbug is saying and what neo-reactionary thought is saying is that if all of these states were managed by corporations and it was the aim of these corporations to have customers rather than subjects, and have these customers pay a certain amount of money for the bundle of services that they would be offered, okay, which goes by the name of government, then maybe you might just get yourself better government than we have right now.
But don't we, to some extent, have that already in many places?
No.
Really? Because I know that definitely here in Montreal, during the middle of the 20th century, the city was just going bankrupt. They were spending too much. There was corruption, various things. And so the province just stepped in and, to a large extent, just removed democracy from Montreal for a while. They said, you're going to be like a little heroin addict, or, you're going to be put in timeout, and the city is going to be administered by a group. It was I can't remember exactly. It was like a bunch of corporate leaders, heads of banks, representative of banks and large corporations that are here. There was some people who represented really important institutions that had a stake in the health and future of the city, like McGill University, for instance, had somebody. And then there was, I think, the church was there as well. But they brought together these stakeholders and they said, the city is in trusteeship. And so we still had a mayor at the time, but the mayor didn't have much power to spend, and they were on a strict budget saying, this is how much, you better live with this. And
so that
went on for a while.
Who ran the place?
It was sort of a combination of sort of leaders of certain corporate and private and public interest groups that, had a stake in Montreal being healthy and safe, and they're the ones that ran the place for a while, right? It was not, people still there was elections, but to a large extent, those elections were like giving a kid a little fake steering wheel when you're in the car, so they can feel like they're driving. Like, oh, you drive like mommy and daddy.
That's what think. That's what I think elections are like, anyway. So, but in the case of Montreal, where'd the tax money go?
The tax money went to pay for services.
Yeah, but
it addressed
who distributed it?
I think there was a municipality.
Who controlled the money? This is always the question.
The money was out of there.
He who controls the tax revenue, okay, runs the government. It's that simple.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, anything else about Moldbug? Uh,
Well, he's there are many sort of interesting things that fall out from his theory of history. One of the things he's notorious for saying is that America is a communist country. Okay, and
that's crazy.
well, it is. It is in a way, and it isn't in a way. Okay, yeah. I mean,
See,
obviously,
that would fit Paul's statement of somebody who's trolling the world, right? That's
Well, I mean, if you just take it out of context without the explanation, then it would make sense. Okay, but if he's saying that, what he is saying is that Bolshevism would have been impossible without America's abeyance and cooperation. And if you look at the early history of Bolshevism from about 1917 at the end of the Second World War, you will see that in fact he does have a point. That's what he means by America as a communist country. Okay.
okay.
So what he's saying is that there was in fact all kinds of Bolshevist influence in America, and I mean really still is essentially. I mean a lot of this stuff has just been swept under the rug. I mean people don't know, for instance, all right, that up through the 1950s, there were serving congressmen who were in fact paid agents of the Soviet government.
Wow.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
No, I've read these things. I mean, the crazy thing is that
okay. I mean,
you had the McCarthyites got all these people that were innocent, and there were people that were actually guilty.
Oh, there were plenty. Oh, there were plenty of people who were guilty in the State Department. Justice Hiss was guilty. Okay,
the Rosenbergs.
Of course, the Rosenbergs
actually were. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course they were. Of course they were. Yeah. Okay, but look, I mean, I live in New York City. All right, I live in the heart of Bolshevist Manhattan. Okay, and, just. And just the other day, all right, one of the congressmen or one of the local councilwomen, okay, introduced some resolution that passed the city council to name some park or other after Ethel Rosenberg, right? Okay, I mean,
really?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's in poor taste.
It's in more than poor taste. Okay, because I mean, look, Bolshevism still reigns supreme. If you live in a large American city and you actually pay any attention to your local government, all right, you will see that that's the case. All right. I mean, they wanted to make, Oscar Lopez Rivera the Grand Marshal of the Puerto Rican parade here. This is what they wanted to do. I mean, do you know who this guy was?
No, I don't.
Lopez Rivera? Lopez Rivera was a bomber for the FALN in the 1970s. Okay.
Wow.
Blew up a bunch of stuff, went to jail for a long time. Okay. Never repented anything, never said he was sorry. Okay. And now, they want to make him Grand Marshal of the Puerto Rican Day Parade. This is the sort of thing you get. So believe me, okay, you see dispersed Bolshevist influence in America, in the major cities in America in particular, which are the progressive strongholds, all right, to this very day. So anyone who has some kind of experience with city government, and Moldbug, I believe his home is San Francisco, so he's as familiar with this as I am, all right, knows that, Moldbug is not entirely talking through his hat when he says that America is a communist country, or at least certain American cities are communist.
Yeah, I get the impression that Moldbug wants us to be... It's not entirely unlike what you find in Plato's Republic, that we should be ruled by these technocratic elites that, people who know what they're talking about, and people, right? And I can see the attraction of that form of government.
Moldbug is
but the problem is how do you get legitimacy?
Legitimacy?
Yeah, how do you get legitimacy? Because that's extremely important. And
if
you say that our king was... God has appointed our king, and enough people believe that, well, that gives that particular form of government legitimacy. And there's various ways to get legitimacy. And one of them, very, very effective way, is to have democratic elections and say that, well, we got so amount of votes, and and so we won fair and square, and so we have the legitimacy to govern for a certain amount of time. So the problem that I very often run into with Moldbug, and I so many times when I was listening to his stuff or reading his stuff, I would write down this note. He doesn't seem to be addressing the problem. Like, you can design, okay, let me put it this way. You can design a really, really amazing system of government, which sounds like a wonderful idea and would work really, really well. But if you have not addressed the question of legitimacy, it's dead in the water. How are you going to do it? So I mean, can you think of any way? Maybe I'm missing where he addressed this, but I don't think the masses are going to willingly say, here, right? We'll trust you to do this.
Let me ask you a question.
Okay.
How does your supermarket obtain legitimacy?
By being open when I want to go there, having good high quality stuff that doesn't make me sick with food poisoning, having good prices, having has what I want at the right price when I want it.
That's right. Your supermarket obtains legitimacy by providing services that you desire better than any competitor might provide those services, right?
Okay.
Why is government any different?
Yeah, I guess it could. I imagine you've read Neil Stevenson, right?
Why is government any different? All right. The fact is the government provides different services, right? Maybe it provides roads, fire services, police, armies, what have you. But they are services.
Mm-hmm.
They are paid for. Other people can provide them too. They can be provided well or badly. Why is this any different?
All right. Well,
you
read Neil Stevenson's novels.
Why is legitimacy required for this particular bundle of services where it's not required for any other particular bundle of services?
I guess because people have an idea that government is a special case, and a lot of people believe that if you try and run a government like a business, it's just apples and oranges. It's not going to work well because there's all sorts of things involved that are not involved in a business.
Like?
Right. I mean, it's the same thing for, right? People say that if you try and govern a state, I mean, Machiavelli says this, right? Like, there's a certain way that you will be really successful militarily, right? In pursuing war, things like that, which may not be a very good way to govern in peace, right? A state. So you have to make sure you're taking the right tool out of the toolbox. I mean, I think likewise, all the way back to Aristotle, there's this tradition of saying that a business person, right, shopkeeper, is not necessarily going to make a great statesman, and is not necessarily going to make a good general. That these require different skill sets.
Sure they do.
And, some of the biggest screw-ups are when people try and apply strategy that's been effective. This is, half of the Prince is about this, that a lot of the failure in the world that we see is because somebody who's been successful at business tries to pursue a war like that, or tries to govern a state like that. Or somebody who's been successful in politics says, well, now I can go be a general, or I can go be a president, right? That doesn't necessarily follow, right?
It may not necessarily follow, but I might remind you that in Machiavelli's time, the Medicis did pretty well at that, didn't they?
They did.
They did. They certainly did. Okay. Yeah. And it wasn't just the Medicis either. All right. It was the Duke of Milan, for instance, and any number of people who were contemporary with Machiavelli, did quite well at managing these things. Okay. Not only as businesses, but as states. Now, it's perfectly true that something that works in one set of circumstances, a strategy that works in one set of circumstances isn't going to work in another, but this is also true of different businesses. The fact that, someone is good at, say, running some kind of manufacturing business does not necessarily mean that, if you put him in charge of some other completely different kind of business, that he's going to succeed at that. These things are not generally transferable, but there's nothing especially transferable about business to business skills as opposed to any of these other kinds of skills. There's nothing really special about that in that regard. That's the first point. The second point is one on legitimacy. Let me point out something about legitimacy. Okay, legitimacy is always a sort of rearguard action. First, there is power, and then there are complaints, and then there are efforts at legitimacy. If you ask yourself, divine right is a fairly late development in the theory of kingship. We don't see divine right until the 17th century with Filmer. Before that, this thing didn't even exist, okay? This was designed as a rearguard action. Similarly with papal infallibility. People think papal infallibility has been around forever. No, okay? Papal infallibility is a creation of, was it Leo, I believe, in the 19th century? Leo?
Yeah, it's pretty late.
It's really, really late, okay? And so these legitimacy things that you speak of are in essence rearguard actions, okay, to shore up a state that has already failed in many other regards. Whereas if a state succeeds and actually provides people with what they want, guess what? They couldn't give a damn about legitimacy, okay? What they care about, all right, is, if they call the cops actually show up, all right? And if their house, if their house is on fire, the fire department shows up. And, the garbage is picked up and things like that. This is what makes a state legitimate. What makes a state legitimate is providing the services it's supposed to provide.
Okay. And yeah, I remember when... growing up in Canada and then living in the United States for a number of years, it always was confusing to me watching American news and reading American newspapers that Americans were always complaining about paying taxes. And they're just like, this sucks, always complaining about taxes when in fact Canadians pay way more tax than Americans do. But then I lived in Baltimore.
Right.
And after living in Baltimore for 6 months, I said, wow, I can completely understand why Americans are complaining about taxes, because, you're in this place where I had to stop riding my bike. I brought my bike down to Baltimore. I had to stop riding it because I would get a flat within 5 minutes because the roads were covered in broken glass. There was garbage. There was garbage and rats around.
That's right.
Right, and so people there were all sorts of parts of the city that were too dangerous to go in. You didn't have, like we have in Canada. You pay a lot of taxes, but you get a really great thing in return. You get safe cities that are clean. The garbage is taken away. You get, very good law enforcement. You get Medicare. You get all these things back. So you think, well, this is a pretty good deal. I'm paying, I'm paying a lot of taxes, but I'm getting great services back. My kids' schools are good. They're actually learning stuff there. Whereas in Baltimore, it was absolutely insane. Like I remember going to some of the high schools there.
Right.
They looked like something like out of the third world. All the paint is peeling off the walls. The textbooks are, the Cold War is still happening in the textbooks. Like they're totally out of date. It was absolutely terrible. And then the teachers were often, barely literate. I talked to some of them and they just, oh my God, I can't believe we're entrusting the future to you. But so I understood after living in the States why they complain about taxes, but it sort of, isn't that kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? So if you underfund a system and then the system sucks and you use that as a rationale for underfunding it further, isn't that sort of stacking the deck against taxation and good government services?
Well, look, okay. Americans complain because we don't feel like we get what we pay for. If you pay a lot of tax money and you don't get proper police protection and you don't get well-maintained roads, then you're going to bitch and moan. This is what Americans do. Now, remember, the fundamental driver of good government in the Moldbug neo-reactionary scheme is exit. Not voice, exit. And the only way you have effective exit is if you have a bunch of choices, a bunch of places you can go. Now, the United States has 50 states, but in effect, these 50 states are ruled very much the same way. All right, because they're all subject to all kinds of federal decrees, and the Fed said you have to do this and you have to do that, and there really isn't that much leeway for state governments to do what they want to. If there was more leeway for state governments and much less leeway for the feds, then you would see real exit and you might see changes.
Well, I think already for a whole bunch of reasons, I don't think the way that education is funded in the United States is a particularly good idea. But leaving that aside for a second, you do have the exit situation where if education is really important to you, you can choose to move to a neighborhood because you know that they have really good schools. And by choosing to move to that neighborhood, you are voluntarily deciding to pay a lot of tax.
Listen.
For those schools.
There's no such thing as neighborhoods with really good schools.
Well, I could say that I've seen schools in a nice neighborhood in New Jersey versus Baltimore.
This is a euphemism. All right.
For what?
For good students and well-heeled parents.
Okay.
But people don't like to say, I'm going to move to a neighborhood with good students and well-heeled parents. So instead they say, I want to move to a neighborhood with good schools. But unless you have good students and well-heeled parents, you don't have good schools. So this is what they're talking about, and this is all that they're talking about.
Okay. Well, I mean,
there's no independent school variable. This does not exist.
Yeah, well, we have the Montreal right now has the highest of any large city in North America. Montreal has the highest percentage of students who go to private school. I think it's somewhere right now about 1/3, sometimes a little higher than that, 35, 37%.
Okay.
So it's very, very high.
Right.
And so a lot of people opt out of the public school system if they have the money and send their kids to private schools. Now, this has all these downstream effects where if a private school has a kid who has learning disabilities or has, or is any kind of a behavior problem, they can chuck them, right? They can just chuck them. So those students get put into the public school system. And so you are loading up the public school system with a much higher percentage of difficult students than they would normally have. And on top of that, you're sort of taking out the most sort of motivated, shit-disturbing parents that have the time and are articulate enough and helicoptery enough, whatever, to really pay attention to what's being taught in math class, for instance. And so if the kids aren't learning trigonometry, and it puts a lot of strain on the public school system.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's
sure.
it totally goes against Taleb's idea of skin in the game, which is to say, well, people should have some sort of a stake. So if governments pass a law saying that you can opt out of the public school system, that has all these adverse effects on the public school system.
In other words, public schools cannot turn anyone away, no matter how much trouble he makes in school.
Yeah, they have to
right.
accept them. So it's sort of similar to. I remember hearing somebody who's in the Canadian military.
Right. So they have to be in school no matter what, right?
Yeah.
How is this?
Yeah, they have to.
Remind me. How is this not like jail again?
Well, you go home at night, right?
Yeah.
You sleep at home at night and you go home for the weekends and things like that.
But while you're there.
Well, I get some of them definitely look like jails when they have locked doors and cameras and stuff like that. That gets a little crazy, right? So no, but I guess why can't the problem
public
is
schools throw people out who obviously have no interest in being in school?
They can at a certain age. It varies from state to state, province to province.
Why not at any age?
Because you have to be in school. You have to be
Right.
at that age. You got to be doing it.
Because,
And
in other words, just because.
just because.
Just because.
Yeah. Just because. I guess you'll be out on the street causing trouble and right. And we know that the vast majority of crime is committed by
At least you won't have
young men between puberty and 25.
At least you won't have a captive audience in school.
Yeah, I guess so. It's just, I just think, for instance, I have a friend who was in the military.
In school, don't you have a captive audience of classmates to prey on?
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you could be if you're a bully, they're all there. Right?
Yeah. They're handy. They're all in one place, right?
Yeah.
So you could shake.
Well, let's just switch to an analogy because I think it'll help
all
you.
Down at once for lunch money.
Well, let's switch to an example. I think it might sort of illustrate what I'm asking you.
Go ahead.
A friend of mine was in the Canadian military for a long time, and when we were talking about running a government like a business and the problems that he saw with it, he made an analogy to the military. He said, when you are running, let's say, an elite unit, right, a special forces unit, something like that, in a situation like that, it is quite analogous to running a business. You can sort of decide, you choose the best of the best and you vet them. And if somebody is not performing in the right way, you get rid of them. And he said, but if you're trying to pursue like a major war where there's a draft and you just need a lot of bodies and you have to sort of go with what you've got, right? And you don't have the luxury of just getting rid of people because they're less than ideal. You have to somehow make this work with what you've got. And he said that is a completely different exercise from a management perspective, in almost every respect. It's a very different exercise. And he said, unfortunately, the problem is with people going into from business, who've been very successful in business, going into government, is they think it's going to be like sort of that special forces unit where you can just fire people and you can sort of call the shots and you can have a lot of control over the process. And he says, in fact, government is much, much more like pursuing a major war where there's all sorts of pieces on the chessboard that are there and you have to deal with them and you can't get rid of them and they're annoying and they are going to be at sort of cross purposes. You have to somehow either find a way to work with them or neutralize them or something, but it's a different skill set, right? And I remember to give another sort of example, at where I work, I remember working with some people on committees and things like that, and they were new hires, new to the college, and they would have this incredibly ruthless Machiavellian way of trying to get their way on a anything, a hiring or something they're trying to pass. And I remember having like a very wise somebody who'd been around for like 25 years in the institution, and he said, you have to remember that this isn't like being a shoe salesman where you do the hard sale to make the one sale. You're going to have to work with these people for decades. So it's much better if you get a bad reputation for being like very, very ruthless and somebody will say and do anything to win. You might win that particular battle, but you're not going to be able to get anything done in the future, right? So, and I see some interesting parallels to what's happening right now with Trump, right? If he's trying to run government the way he ran his business, well, there's all these, you can't just say you're fired, right? You can't just eliminate all the chess pieces on the board that you don't like. There's a bunch of things that you have to somehow work with, right? And he seems to be again and again butting up against this, and he's butting up against it in a very, very predictable way. It's exactly what you would think. It's from somebody who's been successful in a particular domain going into another domain. You could predict that you don't have to believe that Trump is, a bad person or stupid or crazy. You could just eliminate all those things. You could say, what is somebody who's been successful in business likely to do wrong when he tries to be a general? What is he likely to do wrong when he tries to be president? And he's doing many of those things. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, to begin with, permanent employment is not some metaphysical given. It happens to be the case in governments, and it happens to be the case in quasi-government organizations like, Canadian academia or American academia for that matter. But there's no law that says things have to be that way, or that says that the fact that things are that way now means that they will be that way forever. All of these things that you keep talking about bumping up against, okay, as if they were laws of nature or something, are in fact consequences of the permanent government. The reason government in the United States operates the way it does, and the reason elections are mostly dumb show, is that there is a permanent civil service. There is a very large class of people who have permanent government jobs and whom you cannot fire for love or money. And it's really that simple, okay? And until that fact changes, nothing else will really change in any fundamental way. Now, I don't have any great suggestion as to how to change that fact, except to point out that it should not be regarded as some sort of metaphysical given or something without which government could not be run. Government could easily be run without a permanent class of government employees, just as colleges could be run without a permanent class of college employees. There is nothing about this permanence that is required by the nature of the institution or the nature of the services that it provides.
Huh. Because
Right?
you see in Taleb's most recent book where he talks about the difference between if you are, very wealthy and you have a private plane, it might seem on paper like it's a good idea to just sort of hire a pilot when you need to fly, because you might not need to fly for a month or two. But he says actually that runs into logistical problems, because if you actually have a pilot that's a permanent employee of yours, that means that pilot is available to you whenever you need him, rain or shine, any day. And he says
when I say a permanent employee, I do not mean a full-time employee. I mean an employee whom you cannot fire.
Okay.
Different category altogether. This is what makes government government, not the fact that they have people coming in full-time, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, but the fact that they cannot be fired. Okay. All sorts of businesses have full-time employees. Okay. What they don't have is permanent employees. What they don't have is unfireable employees. This is what government has, and this is the fundamental thing that makes government operate the way it does.
Okay. Well, it's different. It's somewhat different in Canada than the United States.
Is it?
But there definitely is that.
If I wanted to fire a federal employee in Canada, what would I have to do?
Well, it would be very hard.
Yeah, I'll bet it would.
The way that they get around it is it's harder.
By very hard,
it's harder and harder to get those permanent jobs. It's harder and harder. So you work all these contracts, and you can be doing contracts for very long time. 10 years. I've heard people going contract to contract, and they've been in government for 12, 14 years. So you do these contracts, and then eventually you get one of these jobs. So up until then, there's lots of opportunities for you to screw up and piss somebody off, and they will not renew your contract. So by the time they're making a decision on you, and they're giving you what is the equivalent of government tenure, basically, once they're doing that, they've vetted you a great deal. Right? So they're not... Now, you might, from that moment, just decide to be like a total loser and never do anything. That definitely happens. But most of the time, from what I've seen and from what I've heard from friends, it doesn't. I mean, by then, the person is really into whatever it is. They work for the Department of Transportation.
Look, I'm not saying
they find
look.
issues interesting intrinsically.
It's
right?
it's very easy for this to be misunderstood. I'm not saying these are bad people or lazy people or anything like that. I think, most government employees are perfectly honest and they try to do a good job. What I'm saying is that when you have a class of permanent employees in the government, these are the people who run the government.
Okay.
All right. This is what I'm saying. Elected officials, appointed officials come and go. The permanent civil service is forever. The government is the permanent civil service. This is the important point. This is why elections are dumb show. And as long as you run things on that principle, they will never change because the permanent civil service has interests of its own and it will follow those interests. Like everybody else.
But if you think about the counterfactual, though, well, not counterfactual. Before they professionalized the civil service at the beginning of the 20th century, one of the major spoils of war, you won an election, you would just appoint all of these people.
Sure.
So all these jobs, there would be a huge amount of rotation, and you just had totally incompetent people. Like somebody who's illiterate put in a position where they have to read.
If I can stop you just for a second there. What's the key word in that paragraph?
Appointed.
No.
Incompetent.
No.
Professionalization.
No.
All right, tell me.
Election.
Election.
Okay. This is what I've been talking about with government. All right. If government is in fact simply a business that provides a bundle of services to consumers who can either consume from you or go elsewhere, then there's no question of elections or incompetence or civil service exams or appointments or any of that nonsense. It is staffed the way any other business is staffed. We'll see what happens. Has there ever been a controversy in private industry about how to, quote, staff business and whether there should be exams and so forth? No, this is entirely a function of Mandaриnism and government itself. Okay, it's like China with the civil service. It's the same sort of business. You see, once you take these things and you remove them and you decide that they're in some special category and they don't belong to anything else, well, then naturally you're going to have all kinds of arguments about, is it to the victor who belong the spoils? I mean, if we're not going to have professionalized civil service, are we going to have a spoils system like Van Buren, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, and all of these things where exit supersedes voice become non-issues, non-conflicts.
Okay. Just want to pivot and ask you two final questions, but they're kind of complicated questions. So Steven Pinker in his new book, one of the various things that he's enlightenment is amazing, everything is amazing.
Right.
He says, don't worry, be happy, right? One of the things he says that is fantastic is that we have sort of freed the individual and that the individual has more and more freedom and more choice as a consumer, as a voter, so on and so forth. We've emancipated groups that were subjugated. We have all this social justice. And he says, all these wonderful things, right? Now, it's very interesting reading Pinker alongside with Yuval Harari, who is like this much more sort of dark, prophetic voice. And Harari says, well, actually, humanism is about to die. And he says algorithms are already undermining the rationale for liberal humanism, which is he says one of the basic assumptions of rational liberal humanism is that the individual knows best what is good for him or her, and that's why the customer is always right and the voters have spoken and and so on and so forth. And he says, but actually already the Facebook algorithm and the Google algorithm, they already know you better than anybody in your life. They know you better than your friends, your family, and just say what I mean by that. The way you would actually sort of test that out is you come up with a list. Harari mentions a couple of different experiments, but you come up with a list of very personal questions, right? 100 questions, and they're multiple choice answers. And then you give this to somebody's wife or somebody's husband or somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend, to their mother, to their best friend, their business partner. And you say, how do you think Aaron would fill this out? Right. And so they answer that, right? And actually, it turns out that your wife really does know you better than anybody else, right? And your mother knows you quite well, and your siblings know you quite well.
Wasn't there a game show with
Facebook
this premise
and
where,
Google,
wives had to guess what the newlywed game. That's what this is like.
Oh, I remember.
Exactly.
That.
It's exactly like this,
oh my
right?
God.
Where,
and that's where I discovered the word whoopee, which is such
okay, well, there you go.
I remember that when I was a kid saying to my mom, what is whoopee? But anyway, so you have this assumption, right? He says already the Facebook algorithm and the Google algorithm, when you give them a question and ask, like, what is Aaron, they do better than Lisa would. They do better than your wife would already, right? And he says, but we're very quickly going to come to the point where the algorithms know you better than you know yourself. So they're going to be hooked up to all sorts of biofeedback data, everything from your heartbeat, your pulse, your hormone levels, stress hormone levels in your breath, all sorts of different things. And so you'll have, let's say, like an app in your smartphone, and you can ask this artificial intelligence really serious questions, like, I'm trying to decide whether I should marry Peter or Paul, and the app will give you better advice than anybody that you know, better than any therapist, better than your best friend, and will give you a detailed reason why you are far more likely to be happy and successful with this person, probability-wise, than that person. And here's all the reasons why. I've read every single text you've ever exchanged with this person. I've heard every phone call. I was there when you were having sex. I can see how much of a good time you had. And he says, this is already happening. And he says, when it comes to the place where the artificial intelligence knows you better than you know yourself, well, now people who have those algorithms, corporations, politicians, political parties that want you to vote a certain way or buy something that they're selling, they will be able to target marketing directly to you in a way that will be highly likely to manipulate you, right? And at that point, when this becomes very, very clear, how do you justify elections anymore? How do you justify just saying that, markets can take care of everything because customers know what's best for them? Well, maybe that was true. In fact, Harari is a huge champion of markets, so he says that that's almost definitely been true for a long time. But in the near future, it won't be, right? So I guess my first question is that. What do you make of that?
What do I make of that?
Yeah, do you think it's a valid concern, or do you think artificial intelligence does it? He likens it to in the 19th century when all of these German scholars were trying to prove the truth of the Bible through philology, and they accidentally figured out. Yeah, they accidentally figured out that the Bible had been edited numerous times, and so in trying to find support, these were not atheists who were cynically trying to tear the tradition down. They thought, well, if we can do this, archaeological digs in the Holy Land, we can prove that the Ark was there, whatever. And they ended up undermining the very faith that they were looking to buttress, right? So he says it's going to be similar, that in pursuing liberal humanism, individualism through artificial intelligence, that we're going to undermine the rationale for individual rights and for we're going to undermine.
We're going to undermine what?
What do you
Freedom
make
of choice?
yeah, we're going to
Well,
undermine, like, the whole idea is that the freely choosing individual is this sacrosanct thing, right? In liberal humanism, that's, and libertarianism partakes in that a great deal as well. That the freely choosing individual is this high good, and we should try and defend that as much as possible and eliminate impediments to it. And he says, well, if we can demonstrate, if it becomes a commonplace that the individual is not freely choosing, then where do you go from there?
Well, is the algorithm choosing for him, or is he just offering better advice?
The algorithm
seems to.
Well, here's the problem.
The algorithm in your is just phone, offering better advice, right? He's saying, all right,
well the algorithm is telling you should vote for this person. Here are your two
romantic choices. I suggest A because of this, and this. But presumably, I could always just say, well, the hell with you and go with B, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Right. But the problem is that you're not the only one that has this algorithm. And there are various groups that, let's say there's a group that really wants the United States to invade Syria, let's say, right? And so they have access to one of these algorithms. They will know precisely how to pitch that thing to you based on incredible amount of data they have on what you respond. So maybe we're going to show this guy a dead baby, right? Like, let's show this guy a dead baby on a beach. That's the way he's going to get into it. We'll show this guy, something completely different, right? Whatever. They will be able to target market things to an unprecedented extent.
Won't this also be true of the non-invaders if we're going to take the Syrian case?
Yes. Right. So increasingly, whoever has whoever has control of these powerful algorithms will be able to control markets and control elections to such an extent that it will undermine confidence in free markets and free elections.
Plus, I can turn off my phone, right? Well, I mean, I can't.
Yeah, but presumably you won't be able to. You won't be able to turn off. Right.
I don't have to listen to any of this stuff, do I?
You can. Well, probably if it's ubiquitous, if it's all over your environment, if it's you watch these like sci-fi movies where the marketing ad talks to you.
I still don't have to listen to it. I mean, we're not talking about the telescreen just yet, are we? Or are we? Not quite. Okay.
Not quite.
So given that I can ignore the algorithms, that I can ignore the advice the algorithms give, or I can shut the algorithms off altogether, I'm not sure I see the insuperable problem this is supposed to pose for freedom of the will. Maybe I'm missing something.
I'm not talking necessary. I don't want to frame it as the whole free will debate because that's just annoying.
It is annoying.
I don't think it's really an annoying debate, and I don't understand why people get excited about it. I'm talking more specifically that if you believe in free markets and if you think that it's really important that people be able to vote with their dollars, so to speak, right? Spend their money on what they want to spend it on. And if, to go back to your exit example, right, from Moldbug, if there is a way to game the system in such a way that people don't actually have an exit possibility, or that the vast majority of people are unable, right, to make free decisions about how to spend their money and how to vote because there's this just unbelievably powerful algorithm that can push in the other direction. If that becomes the case, don't you think that would undermine confidence in free markets and free elections? And if that happened, what next?
What next? let me put your question another way. If we stipulate that a certain despotic consequence comes to pass, will not that despotic consequence come to pass? To which I can answer unequivocally, yes, it will. Because that's really all you're doing.
Well,
you're saying, well, such and such disastrous dystopia will happen, But if this disastrous dystopia happens, won't it lead to a disastrous dystopia? Sure, it will. But on what grounds do you get to stipulate that such a disastrous dystopia will in fact come to pass? That's where you lose me. Okay, you're going to have to give me a scenario, all right, that convinces me that these developments that you are so terrified of are somehow inevitable.
Yeah, I'm not terrified of them. I just see that there are certain political positions, certain economic positions. People, support a particular way of government or a way of organizing the economy or not organizing it, and it's based on certain premises, right? And I can see how some of those premises are going to be eroded.
Do you really think
future.
it's inevitable that everyone will eventually be told by his phone what to do? Is that what you think?
Oh, in terms of those apps? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there's such a huge, if I could have an app like that, I would get it yesterday. I mean, imagine if there was an app in my phone that could, if I'm going to a municipal election, it's a real pain in the ass going and researching the different parties' positions and the individual politicians, and then also looking to see
politicians.
Right, I do, and researching their positions and sort of looking at their track record in the past and whether they're likely to actually do what they say they're going to do, and so on and so forth. It's a real pain in the ass. It would be amazing. It's like you say, what mental effort dwarfs all other costs, right? If there was an app in my phone that I could just click on and say, okay, what my interests are as a father with a mortgage and a job, my situation, in every way. Which should I vote? Which person should I vote for? What party should I vote for? And this app will know what is good for me better than I know it. And so it'll say, well, you should vote for this party, and here's why, and would give like a detailed reason of why. And then I wouldn't have to waste all this time on making that decision. I could, when I'm in a store trying to buy a toaster, this app would immediately know which one was best.
So we give a detailed reason for whatever candidate you wanted to support. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it wouldn't just say choose blue. It would say choose blue, and here's why. Right now, I would trust the app probably, and I wouldn't look for the explanation.
Would that be the good reason or the real reason?
Well, presumably, the app would know me and know what I need and know what I want and would tell me the real reason. It would say precisely why, like you should get this particular warranty because you're kind of careless and you break shit a lot, and I've noticed that you don't take care of your things very well, and so I really think you should get the extra warranty because you're like an idiot. So that would be, and I would love to have an app like that. I mean that just knows and can help you with, and because once again, right, you're one of your aphorisms that I like a great deal. Mental effort dwarfs all other costs. If you could have an app in your phone that would tell you, for instance, you haven't had enough foods with magnesium in them in the last 3 weeks, and so I've noticed that your magnesium levels are low, and that's why you're getting cramps in your leg, John. So when you're in the grocery store, buy this, broccoli, and buy some salmon or, whatever, and say like, because you need some magnesium. That would be so boss. That would be amazing. Like, I would want that yesterday, but I can totally see how that could have some bad effects, because like, take for instance, before phones would have like call display where they'd show the number when they were the old rotary things. When I was a teenager, I had, no joke, I had probably 100 phone numbers memorized in my head. I knew all of my family members, their phone numbers off by heart. All my friends, I knew their numbers off by heart. when the phone, now I don't even know my own phone number, right? Because the machine remembers it for me. And that's nice. And that is definitely, that frees up a lot of space for me to think about stupid shit. but it frees up space. I don't have to but whenever the machine's not working, I'm helpless. I'm like the fat guy who's got to deal with the fact that the elevator's broken. He's got to take the stairs now. Like I'm huffing and puffing and trying to
listen. Every advance that relieves you of a certain labor also incapacitates you to a certain degree. The classic example is writing. We used to be able to memorize thousands of lines of poetry off by heart. People could recite Homer's Iliad and Odyssey from beginning to end, okay, back in ancient Greece. Why? Because nobody wrote anything. Well, guess what? As soon as we started to write things, now we have it on the page, so we don't have to memorize it in our heads anymore. Every single thing is like that. This will be no exception, all right? Essentially, it seems to me that your objection is not that it gives advice, but that it gives such good advice. We get all kinds of advice now. We get advice on everything. We get advice on romance. We get advice on what to buy. We get advice on whom to vote for. We get advice on what to eat. We get advice on you name it, all right? Most of this advice is lousy. So the objection is supposed to be what exactly? All right. All of a sudden, we're getting all of our advice from one source, and the advice is a hell of a lot better than the advice that we used to get. And this is supposed to lead to dystopia? Listen, man, all I can tell you is I got better things to worry about. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, Harai actually, I mentioned to you initially that at the end of his talk, he says, well, here's the ways that I could be wrong. And he says specifically, well, we know that in nature and in ecosystems, very often organisms sort of evolve together and in reaction to each other. So if one thing becomes poisonous, then certain things in the other organisms find a way to become sort of immune to the poison, or it doesn't affect them as much. And so he says chances are, one way I could be wrong is that if governments and political parties and political action, whatever, the Russians, the Russian trolls, or the corporations that are trying to sell you stuff, as they have access to better and better algorithms that are more and more effective, at the same time, consumers and voters are going to be gaining various kinds of apps, like this app I described on the phone, that will make it possible for them to counteract. You'll have algorithms. The government has their algorithm, and you have your guns. Of course, at home,
these are all arms races. All right, that's
exactly the language
it's like military technology. Okay, you develop a weapon, then you develop a counter for that, and you develop a counter for that, and so forth. It's the same thing here. All right. I mean, that's just the way it's going to go. You will be attacked, and your mind will be manipulated in progressively sophisticated ways, and you will have progressively sophisticated defenses against that thing and ways to, disarm it. And if worse comes to worse, well, you can always turn off your phone, at least for a while anyway.
All right. Well, the last question I wanted to ask you, which folds in perfectly to your response to that just now, is Neil Ferguson in his new book. I just got it. I'm about 30 pages in. But Ferguson argues in his new book, it's called the Tower in the Square, or the Square in the Tower. He says that our situation right now, because of social media, is we are more like the 16th century than the 20th century. And so he says the change in what this is going to do for politics and what this is going to do for business and marketing is amazing. So he says, for instance, Luther would have been impossible without the printing press, right? He would have been just another heretic that was burned at the stake. And he says, likewise, Trump would not have won without Facebook, right? So that's his says, no Luther without the printing press, no Trump without Facebook. And he has What do you
Well,
think
it
about
sounds
that
a lot
idea?
like an essay that Eric Raymond wrote a long time ago called "The Cathedral and the Bazaar." Is that my is that just a am I making this up? Well, Raymond was a software guy, and he was talking about open source. Okay, and his theory was that there were really two kinds of software development. All right, one was sort of closed source, which is to say the cathedral. Everything is hierarchical, and it's all done from within, and it's all one corporation. It's all secret. And then there's the bazaar, okay, which is kind of open source, which is to say you take the software and put it out, and anybody can make whatever changes he wants, and anybody can fix whatever bugs he wants. And there's a famous line about software from that, which is that all bugs are shallow with enough eyes. And it's actually turned out to be very largely the case. A lot of extremely useful and very good software has been open sourced and has been developed successfully on that model. And a lot of corporations have taken to open sourcing their software for exactly that reason. I mean, is this the same idea applied to politics, or is it something different?
Well, it is. It's somewhat. I mean, he says that Luther very much was sort of trying to make Christianity open source, right? He said we're going to publish the Bible in the vernacular languages, and where everybody's going to learn how to read, and it's going to have access to, and this is going to. He had this sort of faith: "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Right, and you're this, and he says actually what happened is this led to a couple centuries of horrible bloodshed, and he said what really happened is that yes, some good ideas were spread very effectively by the printing press, but also all sorts of really bad ideas. Like, for instance, he says witchcraft was actually a very rare idea. It was only believed strongly enough that people would act on it in certain kind of little pockets here and there. He said the real witchcraft craze happened because of the printing press. And he said so the bad ideas spread at least as well as the good ideas, right? Now, this is corroborated by, I haven't read it yet. It's like, I'm going to read it this weekend, but there's an article in Science, new article that actually was a very big study of sort of fake news. And it looked at a whole bunch of different issues and was asking the question, is it true that truth comes out in the end, that truth prevails? Right? Does the true version of the events, does that actually come out on top? And apparently what the article demonstrates is that looking at a whole bunch of different episodes, and that's not true. That very often the demonstrably false idea spreads more effectively and is more persistent, and the real idea doesn't actually come out on top. So this very much undermines the idea that the internet is going to set us free. Well, that's the idea, is that the marketplace of ideas, that the best, the fittest ideas. Well, of course, you say only the prettiest win. I love that one. Like when ideas compete freely, the prettiest win, right? So, I mean, but that's, once again, that undermines the basic faith. I mean, people who created these platforms, social media platforms, Neil Ferguson says this. He says, I have no reason to doubt the sincerity of what these people have said. And they said they really thought this was going to be an amazing force for progress, that it was going to bring enlightenment to all sorts of dark corners of the world where people believe weird shit, right?
Yeah.
So
weird.
They're going to bring the light of the truth.
Technology actually has a vector as opposed to a magnitude. Listen, all right? Anybody who studied any history knows this about technology. Technology is not a vector. Technology is a scalar. It is only a scalar. All right. Its direction depends on all kinds of other cultural forces outside of itself. It is only a scalar. Facebook is a scalar. The internet is a scalar. Social media of all sorts is a scalar. All of these things are scalars. The direction is up to you. And why should they have known this? They should have known this because they should have looked back in the 19th century, which was the greatest, still is the greatest period, okay, of technological innovation, communication innovation. Just consider everything that went on from like 1850 to 1890, starting with the telegraph and ending with the phonograph player and shortwave radio. I mean, it's just astonishing advances in communication that dwarf whatever's happened in the internet. So you have all these things going on over a period of 40 or 50 years. Right? All of this communication, all kinds of people can talk to each other, extremely rapidly. They couldn't do this before, all of this great stuff. And it's all supposed to, if there had been a Mark Zuckerberg at the time or a Bill Gates at the time or any of their equivalents, all right, they would have said, well, this is going to usher in a great era of, prosperity and liberty for all, and truth will will out, and this and that. And of course, well, we saw what happened in the first half of the 20th century. Let's just say that that's not exactly what came to pass. All right. Why? Because technology is not a vector. It is a scalar. It was then, it is now. And we are seeing the consequences of that and the consequences of believing that it is something else.
Okay. Just sort of follow up to that, I just thought of this. Stephen Marsh has been really interested in this question in the last year or two, but he argues that the United States is especially vulnerable to sort of attacks like by, troll farms and things like that, to fake news, that it's especially vulnerable vis-a-vis like other first world countries like France, Canada. There's been situations here in Canada where there were outside forces that were trying to kind of sow dissent and various things like that, and it just didn't work, right? And the same thing happened in Germany, the same thing happened in France in the last election. And he says, so there's various reasons why the United States is especially vulnerable to this stuff, and it's not because Americans are, necessarily more gullible or stupider than anybody else. It's more of a structural thing. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think the United States is more susceptible, less, or what do you make of that?
How do we measure dissent zone? I mean, I'm not even sure what March is saying here. Okay, are there more fads in America? Is that the idea?
It would be somewhat similar. Okay, this is not an example he gave, but if I was steel manning his argument, this is something I would definitely draw upon. Okay, I did a lot of my graduate work studying sort of health fads and over in the United States over a couple hundred years. And one thing that is just amazing when you study these things is that, let's say, okay, there's something like vitamin C cures the common cold, or St. John's wort is a natural cure for depression, or whatever, right? When this stuff has been subject to very expensive double-blind studies, and when the evidence comes out, if the government comes out in Germany or France or Canada and says, hey, we just did this 5-year study on vitamin C, and it turns out it doesn't actually cure the common cold at all. It has no effect on how long you're sick. It doesn't prevent you from getting sick. However, if you sense that you feel better after you take 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, we can explain why that is. It's because it's a moderately effective antihistamine. So it'll clear up your snot a little bit, and you'll feel a little bit better, and you'll mistakenly assume that this is because it's curing you, but it's not. It's absolutely not. So when they come out with that evidence, in the sales of vitamin C plummet overnight. Overnight, they plummet. In the United States, doesn't even make a dent. They don't. They just don't buy it. They just they're like, oh, they're lying to us. It's all part of the big conspiracy. the Illuminati, the corporations, they're all like, and so the sales do not drop, right, on something like that. And that makes the United States an outlier.
I think
what do you
probably
make of
has
that?
to do with two things. One is that Germany is a much smaller country. It's got about a quarter of the population of the United States. And the other is that Germany is a much, more, or I should say, a much less diverse country, okay? And certainly a more trusting country. All right. I mean, the United States has had all kinds of history with government recommendations of this and that. All right. For instance, we have government recommendations of nutrition. And we've had these things for years and years and years. And it turns out that, they're basically totally wrong. Okay.
Oh, not only wrong, some of them were willfully lying. I was absolutely shocked to find out that one of the guys that was a main character in my dissertation, Frederick Stare, he was a Harvard professor, and he was a shill for the sugar industry. And he wrote all these books saying that sugar was totally safe and all this stuff. And it's turned out that I think it's his son or his grandson, found a bunch of documents like in the attic, so to speak. And this guy was being paid off by the sugar industry. He was actually, and he had seen with his own eyes lots of studies that demonstrated that he was wrong.
But I don't think most of it is corruption that. I think most of it is just blundering. Okay, most of it is just making mistakes, and a lot of mistakes. People in the United States have seen a lot of mistakes. They're used to a lot of mistakes. They see their government screw up regularly on this score. So the government comes out and says, St. John's wort doesn't do anything for you, or vitamin C doesn't cure the common cold, or whatever the recommendation happens to be. People are going to say, well, we've heard this song before. If they were wrong then, why should they necessarily be right now? I mean, does that make us more gullible? I don't know. I mean, maybe it makes us more sensible. But, I'm not even sure that that's the issue, okay? I think the main issue is that if you have a very large country, it's going to be full of pockets of unbelievers of any sort. It's just going to be full of them. All right. Okay. I mean, for instance, you take Russians, right? Russia has about the population of the United States, and Russians believe in just all manner of magic and conspiracy and foolishness. Ask any Russian, they'll tell you. And I don't think it's because Russians are a notably superstitious people. I just think that, once you get a population that big, you're going to have millions of pockets of millions of believers of, various crank things all reinforcing each other. And this is simply what you see. I'm inclined to think that rather than making fancy assumptions or guesses about psychological makeup of Germans or Americans or Russians, you would be more inclined, it would make more sense to attribute that to scale. A lot of things that look like psychological phenomena are really, in fact, when you get right down to it, just a question of scale. When you have a whole lot of people, you have a whole lot of crazy.
That is such a fantastic final line. I wanted to ask you something else, but we got to end there. That's so awesome.
Thanks, John.
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been absolutely amazing.
All right.
I definitely want to have you on again. This was so great. Especially the second half. It was especially amazing. So have a good time.
All right, John.
And
thanks a lot.
I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye now.
Take care. Bye.